Silas Weatherby grabbed Nora's wrist so hard she dropped her crutch. It clattered into the mud of Red Hollow's Main Street, and every head turned the blacksmith, the women on the mercantile porch, 3 miners eating lunch on a barrel. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. 7 months I fed you, Silas said, loud enough for all of them to hear. 7 months you slept under my roof, and you can't even pull a plow straight. He let go and stepped back, wiping his hand on his trousers like touching her had dirtied him. Pack your things before supper, both dresses. That's all you came with. Nora stood in the street. Her crutch was in the mud. She didn't pick it up right away. She just looked at him. Both dresses, she said quietly. Yes. The men on the barrel started laughing. If a story like this deserves to be told, it deserves to be heard all the way through. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next, because this story goes places nobody in Red Hollow saw coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The mud was cold. Nora knew this before she even reached down for the crutch, because the cold had already soaked through the hem of her dress, and the dress was the better of the 2 she owned. She picked the crutch up anyway, wiped the handle against her sleeve, and kept walking toward the boarding house at the end of the street. Her left leg dragged a 1/4 inch with every step. It always did. She'd stopped noticing it somewhere around age 14, when she realized that noticing it only made other people more comfortable pointing it out. The boarding house was run by a woman named Agnes Pruitt, 62, with iron gray hair and opinions on everything. Agnes was standing at the window when Nora came through the front door, and her expression said she'd already seen what happened in the street. I heard, Agnes said before Nora could speak. Then you know I'll need until tomorrow morning. I know you'll need until tomorrow morning, Agnes agreed. I also know you don't have the rent for tonight. Nora stopped. She had 4 coins in her coat pocket. She'd counted them before breakfast. How much is tonight? 30 cents. She had 28. Agnes watched her count. When Nora came up 2 cents short, Agnes looked at the ceiling for a moment like she was calculating something, then looked back. Get your things out by 6, Agnes said, and don't leave anything in the washroom. Last woman left a hairpin and I found it in my heel for 3 days. I won't leave anything. I know you won't. Agnes paused. You never do. That was the closest thing to kindness Nora had heard in 7 months, and she carried it upstairs with her like a coal in a tin cup, small and hot, and almost enough to keep her hands warm. Her room was 8 feet by 9 feet. It contained a bed, a washstand, and a nail on the wall where she hung her second dress. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 2 dresses, the muddy one she was wearing, and the dry one on the nail, and she did the arithmetic of her situation, the same way she'd been doing it since she was 22. When the wagon axle broke and her leg broke with it, and everyone in her family looked at her the way people look at something they love but can no longer use. First man after the accident, her cousin's husband's brother, Franklin Keyes. He needed a wife for his sheep farm in New Mexico Territory. He sent her back after 4 months. Can't keep up on the hillside, he wrote in a letter to her cousins as if Nora weren't standing right there when he handed it over. Second man, Hector Dunleavy, wheat farmer, South Colorado, 63 days. He didn't write a letter. He just put her bag on the porch. Third, Albert Marsh, cattle rancher. 6 weeks. He said she was pleasant company but not built for the work. He said it to her face, which was almost respectful. 4th through 6th blurred together the way bad years do. Different names. Same arithmetic. 7th, Silas Weatherby. 7 months. Longest yet. She'd actually believed, somewhere around month 4, that Silas might be different. Not because he was kind, he wasn't especially, but because he was practical. And practicality had always seemed to Nora like something she could work with. She kept his accounts. She smoked his meat better than his first wife had, according to his own sister. She stretched his flour supply through a hard February when he couldn't get to town. She thought, this is enough. This has to be enough. It wasn't enough. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and let herself have exactly 4 minutes of feeling sorry for herself, which was her rule. She'd made the rule at 23. 4 minutes was enough to feel it and not enough to drown in it. At minute 5, she sat up, pulled out the 28 cents, and started thinking about what came next. There was nothing in Red Hollow for her. She'd exhausted every connection the town had to offer just by being here 7 months. The mercantile didn't need help. The laundry already had 2 women. The schoolteacher position had been filled in October by a young woman from Denver who had both her legs and a teaching certificate and a bright smile that made the school board very happy. Nora had none of those things. She was pulling her second dress off the nail when she heard the sound from the street below, not voices exactly, more like a shift in the noise of the town. The way sound changes when something unexpected happens in a small place. She went to the window. A man had ridden into Red Hollow. She'd seen large men before. Frontier settlements had plenty of them. But this man was large in a way that stopped the street. He rode a gray horse that was itself enormous, and he sat in the saddle like he'd been put there by a process that had nothing to do with getting on a horse. He wore no hat. His coat was elk hide, roughly stitched, the kind a man makes himself over a winter when store goods aren't available. His hair was dark, and his beard needed work, and his face, even from 2 stories up, had the look of a man who had made all the decisions in his life without consulting anyone else, and who expected that to continue. He stopped in front of the mercantile. He looked at the sign for a long moment, then turned and looked at the town, the way you'd look at a piece of ground you were thinking about digging up. Not hostile, calculating. Then he got off his horse. Nora watched him go inside and went back to her packing. She was downstairs in 20 minutes. 2 dresses folded in her bag, 28 cents in her pocket, no plan beyond the next 12 hours. Agnes was in the kitchen. Nora stopped in the doorway. Is there work anywhere in riding distance? Honest work, I mean. Not, she stopped. Not what? Agnes said without turning around. Not work that requires 2 good legs. Agnes turned around at that. She looked at Nora the way she might look at a broken piece of equipment that she was trying to determine the remaining usefulness of, not unkind, just honest. There's the Calloway Ranch up on the North Fork. Old woman Calloway is down with her back and her son is useless. But that's 18 miles in mud season. I'll walk it. You'll fall into a creek is what you'll do. Agnes paused. There's also the possibility that whatever that mountain man is here for might be something. Nora frowned. Mountain man? Rourke Blackthorn. Agnes said the name the way you'd say the name of a weather condition. He's been up past Ironfang Ridge 3 winters running. Comes down once a year for supplies and repairs and whatever else men like him need. She folded a dishcloth precisely. Last 2 times he came down he was asking about women. Didn't find what he was looking for. What was he looking for? Don't know. Nobody does. That's part of what makes people nervous about him. Nora thought about the man she'd seen from the window. The way he'd looked at the town. He doesn't seem nervous. He's not the one who gets nervous, Agnes said. He causes it. Nora picked up her bag. She went out the front door, and she stood on the porch and looked down the length of Red Hollow's main street, 160 yards of mud and wood, and the particular kind of exhaustion that small frontier towns accumulate when nothing good has happened in a while, and she thought, 4 minutes. She'd already used them, so she started walking. The mercantile was at the far end of the street. She was halfway there when her crutch found a soft spot in the mud and sank, and she lurched sideways and caught herself on a hitching post, and the movement was graceless and loud, and the 3 miners who were still on their barrel watched it happen. One of them said something. The other 2 laughed. She pulled her crutch out of the mud. She kept walking. The mercantile door was heavy. She pushed it open with her shoulder because both her hands were occupied, bag in one, crutch in the other, and she came into the dim interior smelling of tobacco and leather and the particular sharpness of new rope. The man was at the counter. Up close, he was even larger than he'd looked from the window. He was buying a list of things that told a story if you knew how to read it. Salt, 10 pounds. Dried beans, 20 pounds. Sulfur matches, 3 boxes. Cartridges for a rifle. Linseed oil. And he was talking to the storekeeper, Jed Carver, in a voice low enough that Nora couldn't make out words from the doorway. She waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. She didn't have a plan exactly. She had 28 cents and a stubbornness that her mother had always called a character flaw, and that Nora had gradually come to understand was the only tool she'd never been able to leave behind. Jed Carver noticed her first. He looked up from his ledger with the expression he saved for people who owed him money or took up space he needed. "Help you, Miss Bellrose." The mountain man turned around. This was the moment Nora had not planned for. She'd expected to wait, to overhear something useful, to find a natural opening. She had not expected to be the thing he turned to look at. He was maybe 40. Hard to tell with men who lived outdoors. His eyes were dark gray, not blue, gray, and they moved across her with the same efficiency they'd probably moved across the street earlier. Not rude, just thorough. He was the kind of man who looked at things to understand them, not to judge them. His eyes went to her crutch, then to her bag, then to her face. "You leaving or arriving?" he said. His voice was lower up close than she'd expected. Not soft, just controlled. "Neither," Nora said, currently standing still. Something moved in his face, not a smile exactly. A recognition. "Rourke Blackthorn," he said. "Nora Bellrose, Nora. Jed tells me you've been in town 7 months." She looked at Jed, who studied his ledger with sudden great intensity. "Jed talks," she said. "Small town," Rourke said, which wasn't an apology for either of them. "He also tells me you're good at keeping accounts, and you smoke meat well, and you're not staying." Nora felt the strange sensation of being summarized accurately by a stranger. "That's correct. Where are you going?" "I haven't decided yet." He looked at her for a long moment, not uncomfortable. Just a man thinking. "You're looking for work or looking for a situation?" She almost said work, because work was the safer answer, the more dignified answer. But she'd been answering safely for 5 years, and she had 28 cents and a muddy dress. "Both," she said. Rourke turned back to Jed. "Add a woman's winter coat to that. Good quality. And boots, what size are you?" He looked back at Nora. She told him. Not because she'd decided anything. Because the question was reasonable, and she was cold, and her current boots had been resoled twice, and were starting to lose the argument with the Colorado mud. Jed added it to the list. Rourke looked at her again. "You want to know what I need. I want to know what you're asking. Fair." He picked up a bolt of rope from the counter and turned it over in his hands, like he was thinking about something other than the rope. "I live past Ironfang Ridge, 4 hours in good weather, 6 in bad. Nearest neighbor is 20 miles. Nearest town is here, and I come down once a year." He set the rope down. "I need someone who can manage a household in conditions that would break most people. Winter up there runs 7 months. We lose the trail in November. Whatever's in the cabin in October is all we have until March. What do you have now?" He looked surprised at the question, like he hadn't expected her to ask about inventory. "Enough," he said. "But a man living alone doesn't keep things the way they should be kept. And you need—" She stopped, made herself say it clearly. "A wife. I need a partner," he said. "Wife is what the law calls it. What I mean is someone who can think when things go wrong and work when it isn't convenient and not lose their head when the weather turns bad. And in exchange, shelter, food, fairness." He paused. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Nora thought about Silas Weatherby's hand on her wrist, the mud on her dress. 28 cents. She thought about 4 minutes. "What can you do?" Rourke asked. She looked at him. "Cook. So, preserve meat, set a splint, shoot straight." His eyes went to her crutch again. Not with pity, with the look of a man calculating load capacity. "Can you endure?" "Try me," she said. The mercantile was quiet. Jed Carver's pen had stopped moving. Rourke nodded once, the way a man nods when he's made a decision he was already 60% committed to. "We leave in 2 hours. I need to finish here and get the horses sorted." He turned back to the counter. "Go have something to eat. Jed's wife does a good breakfast. I have 28 cents. Jed will put it on my account." He said this without looking up, without drama, like it was a logistical fact and not an act of anything. Nora stood for a moment. "I haven't said yes," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "You haven't said no." She went to have breakfast. She sat in Jed Carver's back room at a table with a red oilcloth and ate eggs and salt pork and a piece of bread that was 2 days old, but still better than what she'd had at Silas Weatherby's in February. Jed's wife, a compact woman named Ruth, who talked the way some people eat constantly, and without apparent need for encouragement, told her 3 separate things about Rourke Blackthorn that Nora hadn't asked for. First, he had killed 2 men, but both of them had started it, and the sheriff at the time had agreed. Second, his cabin past Ironfang Ridge was, according to a trapper who'd sheltered there once, surprisingly well built. Third, he had never, in Ruth's memory, been cruel to anyone who hadn't earned it. "He's not warm," Ruth said, refilling Nora's coffee without being asked. "I want to be honest with you. He's not the type to bring you flowers or hold your hand at church. He's the type to fix your roof and not mention it." "I've had warm," Nora said. "It hasn't worked out." Ruth looked at her. "No, I suppose it hasn't." Nora finished her coffee. She thought about what she was walking into or riding into, she supposed, since 4 hours on a trail in mud season on one good leg was not something she'd accomplish on foot. She thought about Ironfang Ridge, which she'd never seen but which people in Red Hollow mentioned the way they mentioned winter, as a fact of life that required preparation and couldn't be negotiated with. She thought about the fact that she had no other options that didn't involve 18 miles of mud road and an old woman's bad back, and no guarantee of anything at the end of it. She thought about the way Rourke Blackthorn had looked at her crutch. Not with pity, not with the particular kind of discomfort she'd learned to recognize in men who were trying to decide how to tell her she was inconvenient. He'd looked at it like it was information. That was new. She went back to the mercantile. Rourke was loading supplies onto a pack horse, working with the systematic efficiency of a man who had done this many times in many conditions. He'd lashed the heavier things low and distributed the weight with the attention of someone who understood what it cost a horse to carry unevenly on a mountain trail. He saw her come out. He didn't say anything. "I have conditions," she said. He kept working. "Tell me, I work, I don't sit. Whatever I can do, I do. You don't make decisions for me about what I'm capable of. If I say I can manage something, you let me try it before you decide I can't. Done. And if this doesn't work," she stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish this. If this doesn't work, she had nothing. That was the truth. But she wasn't going to say that. "If this doesn't work, I need to know you'll see me back to town in the spring." He looked at her then. "If it doesn't work," he said, "I'll see you back to town in the spring." "That's fair. One more thing." He waited. "Don't pity me," she said. "I've had enough of that to last 3 lifetimes. You have a problem with what I can't do. You tell me straight. You don't hint at it, and you don't do me favors I didn't ask for." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't pity people," he said. "Waste of time." She believed him, which was strange, because she had stopped believing men fairly early in the process of being returned by all of them. But there was something in the flatness of his answer, the lack of reassurance, the absence of the particular soft voice men used when they were managing her feelings, that felt more honest than anything Silas Weatherby had said in 7 months. "All right," she said. "Get your bag," he said. He'd already secured the pack horse. The gray horse he'd ridden in on was standing to one side, and there was a second horse beside it, a solid bay mare, shorter than the gray and calmer looking. Rourke had put a step on the near side, a wooden block that could be kicked into position to make mounting easier. She noticed it, but didn't say anything. He held the mare steady while she mounted. It took her longer than a person with 2 functional legs. Her crutch was a problem she solved by tucking it across the saddle in front of her, which was awkward and not ideal, and she'd have to work out a better system. But she got up without falling and without asking for help. Rourke mounted the gray. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." He turned the gray toward the north end of town, toward Ironfang Ridge, and the trail that led up into country that the people of Red Hollow talked about, mostly in terms of what it had taken from them. Nora followed on the bay. They passed through town the short way, and she saw people watching. Agnes Pruitt on her porch. The miners on their barrel, quiet now. Silas Weatherby coming out of the feed store, stopping when he saw her on the horse, his face doing something complicated that she didn't have time to read, because she wasn't going to slow down to read it. She looked forward. The trail north of Red Hollow climbed almost immediately, cutting through a stand of bare aspens, and then rising along a ridge where the mud gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to packed earth, and then, further up, to patches of snow that hadn't left since November. The bay mare picked her way carefully. Rourke's gray set a pace that was measured and steady, not fast, not slow, the pace of a man who understood that miles mattered more than speed. Nora's left leg ached. It always ached in cold weather. She'd learned to breathe through it, the way you learn to breathe through anything that can't be fixed steadily, without complaint, attending to it just enough to manage it, and not enough to let it become the whole story. An hour up the trail, Rourke stopped. He got off his horse and went around to the gray's near side and appeared to be checking the saddle girth. He spent a full 2 minutes on this task. The saddle did not appear to need adjustment. Nora watched him. Then she understood. He was giving her a rest without calling it a rest. He was stopping because they were on a steep section of trail, and she'd been holding her bad leg at an angle for an hour, and her face probably showed it, though she'd tried to keep it even. He'd found a reason to stop that had nothing to do with her. She felt something complicated and specific, gratitude and the fear of gratitude in equal measure. She'd been grateful to men before, and it had always turned into debt. But he didn't look at her while he checked the saddle. He didn't say anything like, "Let me know if you need to stop or it's no trouble." He just did the thing and got back on his horse. Moving, he said, which was apparently all the announcement the situation required. Moving, she said. 2 hours further up the trail, the aspens gave way to spruce, and the spruce were thick and the trail narrowed, and the snow was consistent now, not patches. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since they left Red Hollow. Nora was wearing the new coat Rourke had handed it to her before they left without ceremony, and it was heavy wool lined with something soft and the warmest thing she'd worn in years, but her hands were cold. She didn't say anything about her hands. Rourke pulled up at a place where the trail widened slightly near a frozen stream. He unstrapped something from the pack horse and held it back to her. Gloves, thick leather, lined. Mine are too big, she said. They're not mine, he said. Jed's wife sent them. She thought you'd forget gloves. Ruth Carver had put gloves in the supplies. Nora put them on. They fit. Tell her thank you, Nora said. When we're down next. She won't need telling, Rourke said. She'll assume you figured it out. They moved on. By late afternoon, the trail had climbed into true mountain country, where the spruce grew enormous, and the shadows came early, and the wind had an edge that wasn't about cold so much as intention. Nora had stopped thinking about Red Hollow. She was thinking about the next 20 feet of trail, the way the bay was handling the footing, the angle of her bad leg, the weight of her crutch across the saddle. When the cabin came into view, she almost didn't see it at first, because it was built into a natural shelf in the rock face, and the logs had weathered to the same gray-brown as the stone around them. It was larger than she'd expected, one main room, and what looked like two smaller additions, with a separate structure for animals, and another for what she'd later learn was the smokehouse. Rourke dismounted at the animal shelter and began unsaddling the gray. Nora got down from the bay by herself. It was not graceful. The step he'd put on in town was not here it had been for the mounting at Red Hollow, not for the trail, and she had to manage the dismount by feel, moving her right leg over first, and then lowering herself carefully, and landing on her right foot, and letting her left come down after. She lost her balance for a moment, and caught the saddle, and righted herself. Rourke was unsaddling the gray and did not look over. She didn't know if he hadn't noticed, or if he had noticed, and was doing what he'd done on the trail, finding something else to look at. Either way. She pulled her crutch off the saddle, and got her feet under her and looked at the cabin. Wood's in the lean-to on the left side, Rourke said, still not looking over. Fire's been banked since I left. Should still have coals. Tinder's in the box beside the hearth. He was telling her what needed doing. Not asking if she could do it. Not offering to do it himself. She found the lean-to. She found the wood. She carried 3 loads into the cabin, which took twice as long as it would have taken an able-bodied person, and left her breathing harder than she wanted to admit. The fire had coals. She built it up with tinder and small wood and then larger pieces, and by the time Rourke had unsaddled and fed and settled both horses and the pack horse, there was a real fire going, and the cabin was starting to warm. He came in and looked at the fire. Good, he said. Just that. Good. She found out later, weeks later, when she had the measure of him that good, from Rourke Blackthorn, was the equivalent of another man giving a standing ovation. But she didn't know that yet. She just knew that she was inside a warm cabin on the side of a mountain in the Colorado high country, and the fire was burning. Well, and she had, for the first time in 7 months, a place to be in the morning that was actually hers. I'll need to understand the stores, she said. Everything in the larder and the smokehouse. Whatever's preserved. What you have and what you're missing. Rourke sat down at the rough table in the center of the main room. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight we eat what I've got and sleep. What have you got? He looked at her. Dried venison, he said. Cornmeal, coffee, some salt pork that's getting old. I can make something with that. I know, he said. That's why you're here. She made something with that. It wasn't much a pan of cornbread and the venison cut thin and fried, with the salt pork and a pot of black coffee. But it was hot, and it was edible, and they ate it at the rough table while the fire worked on, warming the corners of the cabin. He ate quickly and without comment. She ate carefully because her leg hurt, and she was tired in a way that went into the bone, and she was trying to decide if this was a sustainable kind of tired or the beginning of the kind that breaks you. How long have you been up here alone? She asked. 3 years. Since before the last 2 winters? Yes. She thought about 3 winters alone past Ironfang Ridge. The arithmetic of that, 3 years of keeping your own fire, 3 years of making decisions with nobody to check them against, 3 years of silence that was actual silence, not the polite kind. Did you want company, she said, or did you need it? He thought about this. She could see him actually thinking about it, not performing the thinking. Both, he said finally. Not the same kind. No, she agreed. They're different problems. He looked at her across the table. Not warm, exactly, but present. The way some people are fully present without making a production of it. Sleep, he said. In the morning, I'll show you the layout, the trail conditions, the things you need to know before the weather changes. How soon does the weather change? It already changed, he said. You just can't see it yet. She looked at the window, which showed nothing but darkness and a pale smear of cloud against a darker sky. The wind was moving in the spruce outside, not loud yet, just present. She would understand what he meant 3 days later, when the first real snow of the season came down off the ridge and settled over the cabin like a decision that had been building for weeks. But that night she banked the fire the way she'd learned to do on her family's farm a long time ago, checked the latch on the door against the wind, found the spare blankets in the chest at the foot of the bunk he'd indicated was hers, and lay down in the darkness of a cabin in the high Colorado mountains thinking, this is either the best decision I've made in 5 years or the worst one. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere further up the ridge, something that sounded like a timber cracking sharp and final, as a door closing echoed once and was gone. She woke up the first morning, not knowing where she was. That happened sometimes. It had been happening for 5 years, ever since she'd started moving from one man's household to another's, waking in unfamiliar rooms with unfamiliar ceiling beams and the wrong smell in the air. For 2 or 3 seconds every morning, she'd have to reconstruct herself, who she was, where she was, how she'd gotten there. This morning, the reconstruction went. Cold air, wood smoke, the sound of wind in spruce trees, and the particular stillness of a place that is far from anything else. Ironfang Ridge. She sat up. The fire had burned down to coals, which meant she'd slept longer than she meant to. The cabin was cold enough that her breath showed. She could hear Rourke outside, the rhythmic sound of an axe working through wood, unhurried, steady as a clock. She dressed quickly, rebuilt the fire from the coals, using the method her father had taught her when she was 7 years old, and had coffee on before the cabin was fully warm. It wasn't a heroic act. It was just what needed doing, and she did it, and her leg ached the way it always ached in the first minutes after sleep, and she moved around it the way she always did. When Rourke came in, he was carrying a load of split wood under one arm, and he smelled like cold air and pine pitch. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the fire. He put the wood down and poured himself a cup. Stores, Nora said. Show me today. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. You sure you don't want breakfast first? I can assess the stores and make breakfast at the same time. I'm not delicate. Something moved in his face, not amusement exactly. Adjustment. Like he was revising a number he'd been working with. All right, he said. The larder was a low room built into the rock face behind the cabin, accessed through a heavy door that Rourke had to duck to get through. It was cold inside, deliberately so the rock kept the temperature steady through winter, which was the point. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at what he had. It wasn't good. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't good. There was dried venison, maybe 40 pounds, hung in strips. A barrel of cornmeal, 3/4 full. Salt pork and brine, a small crock. Dried beans, 2 varieties. Some root vegetables that were starting to look questionable, turnips, a few potatoes. A crock of lard. Coffee, enough for 2 months if they were careful. Sugar, very little. Salt in good supply. You planned for one, she said. I planned for one, he agreed. And now there are 2. Yes, she did the math. Mountain winter's running 7 months, he'd said. November through March, at least. Possibly into April, depending on the ridge. 2 people instead of 1 changes every calculation. You need to hunt, she said, before the weather locks us in. I know. And I need to go through those root vegetables today. The ones that are going soft will go bad and take the good ones with them. I know that too. Then why? She stopped. Why haven't I done it? He was quiet for a moment. A man living alone learns to manage things when they get bad enough. He doesn't always catch them before. It wasn't an excuse. It was just the truth of how people operate when there's nobody watching. Nora had lived like that for short stretches between situations, between men who'd sent her back, and she knew how quickly standards slipped when you were the only one who'd notice. All right, she said. I'll sort the vegetables. You need to go out today? Trap line needs checking. Eastern slope, how long? Back before dark. I'll have something on when you get back. He looked at her. You don't have to cook every day. That wasn't the arrangement. I'm going to cook every day, she said, because it's the most efficient use of my time, and because I'm better at it than you are, which I'll know for certain after I see what you've been eating, but I'm already fairly sure. He thought about arguing with this. She could see him considering it. He didn't argue. He finished his coffee and went to get his coat and his rifle. At the door, he stopped. The potatoes that have soft spots on one side only cut the spot off, and they're still good. Throw out the ones that are soft all the way through. I know, she said. Right, he said. And left. She spent the morning sorting vegetables, which was not a small job. Some of the potatoes were further gone than he'd realized, and 2 of the turnips were entirely lost. And she set those aside and took inventory of what remained with the careful attention of a woman who had been responsible for a household's food supply before. On the frontier farm where she'd grown up, a miscalculation about winter stores wasn't an inconvenience. It was a disaster. She had learned to count things in winter the way other people counted money. By her calculation, with care, they had enough for 2 people through February. March would require either a successful hunting season or significant rationing. Neither option was comfortable. She made a list, writing in the small journal she'd kept in her bag since she was 19. Not a diary, she'd never had patience for diaries. An inventory book, a record of what things cost and what they were worth and what could be traded for what. She'd kept it through 7 households, and it was the most useful thing she owned. She wrote 2 people, 7 months possible. Hunt essential. Beans can stretch farther than meat if spiced right. Cornmeal requires management not more than half a pound per day between 2 people if we're to have any in March. Then she went through the cabin itself. She'd only seen it by firelight the night before, and daylight what there was of it. Through the 2 small windows showed her things she'd missed. The cabin was solidly built, she'd give him that. The logs were well fitted. The chinking was in good repair. The floor was rough-planed boards that were uneven but sound. He'd built shelving along one wall that was practical, if not elegant. The main room held the hearth, the table with 2 chairs, the shelving, and a workbench along the south wall that was covered with tools in various states of repair. The sleeping area was a separate room through a low doorway, 2 bunks built into the wall. Her blankets were on the lower one. His were on the upper, and they were military folded with a precision that said something about how he'd learned to live, though she didn't know what exactly. The second addition was the smaller storage room larder and the door she'd already been through. The third was a kind of lean-to-work space that was open on one side and contained what he used for butchering, and a set of tools she'd seen on frontier farms but not all in one place. A heavy saw, a block and tackle rigged from the ceiling beam, hooks for hanging carcasses. He was serious about the hunting, at least. She went back inside and made bread from the cornmeal, which was not technically bread, it was cornbread in a cast iron pan. The kind you eat because it's food and not because it's good, and she fried the remaining salt pork from the morning and kept it warm at the side of the hearth. Rourke came back before dark, which was 4 o'clock at this elevation in this season, with a deer over his horse's hindquarters. He came in while she was hanging the cornbread pan back on its hook, and he looked at the food on the hearth and he said, "Good." Then he went back outside to deal with the deer. She helped him. He didn't ask her to. She simply came out and took up a position on the side that made sense given her mobility and the way he was working, and she held things and moved things and did what was useful to do. He noticed this and adjusted his own movements to account for her, and they worked around the deer in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father's farm," she said. "We had deer every winter." "Your father let you work the butchering?" "My father had 4 daughters and no sons. He didn't have the luxury of deciding what women should and shouldn't do." Rourke considered this. "Smart man, he was," she said. "He's been dead 8 years." "I'm sorry. He lived well," she said. "That's more than most people get." They finished with the deer, and she took what she needed inside to start working on it immediately, because fresh meat in a cold larder was one thing, but getting it properly smoked and dried before the temperature swung was another thing entirely. "I need the smokehouse," she said. "It's yours," he said. "I'll need to understand how you've been running it," he told her. She listened carefully, asking specific questions when something wasn't clear. He answered without elaboration or impatience, the way people answer when they know what they're talking in and don't need to perform it. By full dark, they had the first cuts in the smokehouse, and she had broth on the fire from the bones, and the cornbread was on the table with the fried pork from earlier, And Rourke came in from the final check on the horses and sat down and looked at what she'd put together. You cooked today and sorted the stores and helped with the deer, he said. Yes, that's a full day's work for a person with 2 good legs. She looked up from her bowl. Was that a comment on my legs? He met her eyes. It was a comment on your workload. She looked back at her bowl. I paced it. I can see that. He ate for a moment. The broth is good. The bones had a lot left in them, she said. You weren't cooking them long enough. I wasn't cooking them at all. She looked up again. I was eating jerky and cornmeal, he said, with no apparent embarrassment about this. That's what a man alone eats when he's busy. That's what a man alone eats when he's stopped paying attention to himself, she said. He was quiet. I'm not criticizing, she said, because she could hear how it had come out. I've done the same. When I was between situations, I ate badly because cooking for one person properly felt like an argument I was too tired to have with myself. He looked at her. Between situations. That's what I call it. How many situations? She met his eyes. 7 before this. He didn't look away. And they all sent you back. Yes, all of them for the leg. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Some of them said other things. But yes. He finished his bowl. He got up and went to the hearth and refilled it from the broth pot without asking, which she noted he didn't ask. He just did it, which meant he was comfortable enough not to perform the manners. That was either good or worrying, and she hadn't decided which yet. You did good work today, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her sharply. You told me not to be falsely modest, she said. You didn't say that exactly, but it was implied. He sat back down. It was implied, he agreed. She ate the rest of her broth. Outside, the wind was picking up again. It had been picking up every night since she'd arrived, not dramatically, not with the sound of a storm, just the steady increase of a system, building itself somewhere above the ridge line. That wind, she said. Building, he said. How long? Another day. Maybe 2. Then we'll get the first real snow. He looked at the window. When it comes, it'll come fast. I'll need to get the horses in before it starts and get the extra firewood inside and make sure the smokehouse is sealed. I can do the smokehouse, she said. He looked at her. I can do the smokehouse, she repeated. Tell me what sealed looks like and I'll do it. He described it, the gaps in the upper venting that needed to be packed with specific material, the door latch that tended to loosen in wind, the drying racks that needed securing against the internal draft if snow came through the vent gaps. She asked 2 questions and he answered them. All right, he said. If you do the smokehouse, I can get the horses in faster and get more wood inside. That's the point, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression. She was starting to recognize the revision expression, the adjusting the number look. Yes, he said. That's the point. They went to bed and the wind did not stop. She woke in the night to a sound she couldn't place at first. Not the wind, not the fire, something else. A high, thin sound from somewhere above the cabin. She lay still and listened, and gradually understood it was the ridge itself, wind at altitude, finding gaps in the rock, producing a note that was almost musical and completely eerie. She'd heard similar sounds on the high plains, never on a mountain. After a while, she went back to sleep. In the morning, the snow had started. Not the full storm yet that was still building. Rourke confirmed over coffee, but the advance of it, steady fine flakes that came sideways in the wind and accumulated faster than they looked like they should. Nora went to the smokehouse before breakfast. The gaps in the upper venting were where he'd described them, and she packed them with the dampened clay he kept in a bucket for the purpose, working on a short stepladder that was already in the smokehouse, and that she suspected he'd put there intentionally, since it was the right height for someone shorter than him to reach the gaps without trouble. She didn't comment on this. She just used the ladder. The door latch was exactly as described, loose, pulling to the left, needing the pin reset. She reset it. The racks she secured with the wire he'd shown her. She went through the whole smokehouse in an hour and a quarter, came back inside with clay on her hands and cold in her bones, and made breakfast. Rourke came in from the horses as she was putting cornbread in the pan. Done, he said. Done, she said. Any issues? The clay bucket is getting low. You'll want more before the next time you need it. He made a sound that she was learning, meant noted, filed, agreed with. She put breakfast on the table, and they ate while the snow built outside. The storm came that afternoon. It came the way Rourke had described, fast, with a serious intent. Within 2 hours of the first heavy flakes, visibility at the window was less than 20 feet. The sound of it was a constant low rush that she'd initially thought was wind, but was actually the aggregate sound of that much snow moving that fast. Rourke was calm. Not the performative calm of a man suppressing fear. She'd seen that on men before, and it had a specific tight quality. This was the calm of a man who had seen this before, who had prepared for it, who understood that preparation was the only response available, and had made his preparation. She matched it. Not because she wasn't concerned the storm was serious, and she could see that, but because concern without action was just suffering, and she had the same allergy to useless suffering that she had to useless pity. "What needs doing?" she said. He went through the list. Check the firewood stack inside. Make sure the stack would last 3 days. Fill the water vessels before the outdoor supply froze solid. Bank the fire to the depth for overnight. Check the door seal. She did the water vessels while he did the firewood. Her bad leg made the water barrel awkward. It was heavy, and she couldn't carry it the way an able-bodied person would, had to move it in stages, tipping it slightly and letting it pour into the smaller vessels she could actually manage. It took longer, and she spilled some, and she cleaned the spill because a slick floor in a mountain cabin in winter was a serious problem. She got the vessels filled. Rourke noticed the water on the floor and said nothing. He got a rag and helped clean it without being asked and without making anything of it. That was the first time she thought. He actually meant it. All of it. The evening of the first storm was the first time they really talked, not information exchange. It happened because there was nothing left to do. The cabin was prepared. The fire was right. The horses were in. The food was handled. And outside the storm was doing what storms do, and there was no point in pretending to be busy. She was mending one of his shirts. He was at the workbench doing something with a piece of leather. And at some point, one of them said something. She couldn't remember afterward who started it, and they found themselves actually talking about things beyond logistics. "How'd you end up out here?" she asked. Not the mountain specifically. The frontier. He didn't answer immediately. He worked on the leather for a moment. "Army," he said, 8 years. Came out and didn't want to go back east. Didn't know anything useful in the east anyway. What did the Army teach you? How to build things. How to read terrain. How to get through a winter without dying." He paused. "How people behave when things go bad. How do they behave?" He looked up from the leather. Most of them smaller than they thought they'd be. She thought about that. "And some of them bigger?" "Some," he said, "rarely." She sewed for a moment. "Which were you?" He looked at her. "I didn't know until I was in it. That's the only honest answer." She nodded. She respected that answer. "What about you?" he said. "Before the wagon accident." "Farm girl," she said. "Southern Colorado. My father grew wheat and ran a few cattle, and we all worked. All 4 girls. And the accident axle broke on a downhill slope. The wagon rolled. I was thrown clear mostly, but my left leg caught under the wheel as it went over." She said this matter-of-factly, the way she'd learned to say it. Not performing distance, it had just been a long time. Healed wrong. My father couldn't afford a proper doctor. The man who said it did his best, but his best wasn't quite right. Did it hurt? Afterward. "It hurt for a year," she said. "Then it just ached. Now it's just the way things are." She bit the thread. The leg was the least of it, honestly. The leg I could deal with. What I couldn't deal with was everyone deciding what the leg meant about me. That was the part that took the most work. Rourke was quiet for a moment. And what did it mean? According to them. That I couldn't work hard enough to be worth the cost of feeding. He looked at her steadily. "They were wrong." "I know that," she said. "I always knew that." The problem was knowing it didn't change what they did. He went back to the leather. Outside, the storm was making the sound it made, the constant rush and the periodic creak of the spruce trees under snow load. "You've been alone a long time," he said. "Even when you were with them." "That's what I mean." She looked at him. It was a more precise observation than she'd expected from him, and it landed somewhere specific. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right. I know something about that," he said. It was all he said. He didn't expand it or make it into a speech. He just said it and went back to his work, and she went back to hers. And that was enough. That was in some ways more than she'd gotten from a conversation in 5 years. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days was a long time to be inside a small space with a person you barely knew. She'd been braced for it, for the friction of it, for the particular irritations that develop when proximity is unavoidable. She'd lived in close quarters with difficult people and knew how fast small things could become large ones. What actually happened was different. They developed a rhythm, and the rhythm worked because neither of them needed noise to feel comfortable. She'd been surrounded by people who needed noise. Silas Weatherby had talked constantly, filling every silence like he was afraid of what silence might say. Rourke treated silence like a reasonable alternative to talking rather than a problem to be solved. She found that she could think in his presence. Properly think, follow a line of reasoning to its end without being interrupted or redirected. The cooking improved because she had time to do it properly. She made a proper venison stew on the second day, real stew, thickened with a little of the flour she'd found at the back of the larder, with the turnips cut small and the beans softened overnight. Rourke ate 2 bowls and did not comment directly, but he poured a second cup of coffee and sat at the table a little longer than usual, and she took that to mean the stew had been good. On the third day, he taught her the stove's moods. Every stove had them the places it ran hot, the places it ran cool, the way it handled green wood versus seasoned wood, the draft adjustments that mattered in high wind versus calm. He showed her without condescension, explaining the reasoning rather than just the method, and she asked questions and he answered them. "You're faster to pick things up than most people," he said. "I had to be," she said. 7 different households. "You learn fast or you become a burden." "You were never a burden," he said. "They just didn't know how to use what they had." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. He'd said it, the way he said practical things without calculation, without the awareness that it was also something else. She thought, he means it exactly as literally as it sounds. He is talking about resources. She thought, and somehow that is more comforting than if he'd meant it as a compliment. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The silence that came after was so complete and so sudden that Nora woke from a dead sleep at 3 a.m. thinking something was wrong. She lay still and listened, and what she heard was nothing, no wind, no snow moving, no creak of the trees. Just the sound of a fire burning in the next room and the occasional pop of the wood. She got up and went to the window. The moon was out. The sky was clear and deep, and the stars at this altitude had a hard, bright quality she hadn't seen since her childhood, before her father's farm had gotten close enough to town to have the glow. The snow was deep 3 feet, at least in the open areas, drifted to twice that where the wind had piled it. The smokehouse had a drift against one wall that reached the eave. The lean-to where the tools were kept was half buried. It was, objectively, a beautiful view. She noted that, and then moved on to the practical assessment, which was what the morning would require. The path to the smokehouse would need clearing, and the door on the animal shelter would be drifted in. She went back to bed. In the morning she was up before Rourke, which she'd come to understand was unusual. He woke early by nature and was generally doing something by the time she rose. But this morning she was at the hearth when he came out of the sleeping room, pulling on his coat. He looked at her. He looked at the fire, which was going well. "You were up," he said, "at 3. The storm stopped. I heard it." "I looked at the smokehouse drift," she said. "The door will be clear. The drift is against the north wall, not the door side. But the path from here will need clearing." He was quiet for a moment. "You were thinking about the smokehouse at 3 a.m. "I was thinking about everything," she said. "It's what I do when I wake up in the night. I take inventory." He sat down at the table. "Of what?" She handed him his coffee. "Of whatever needs managing." She sat across from him. "It started after the accident. I couldn't sleep well for a year, and I needed something to do with the awake hours that wasn't just lying there. So I started going through what needed doing. Planning. Calculating. Did it help? It gave me something to control," she said, "when everything else felt out of my control. So yes, it helped." He drank his coffee. Outside the morning was bright and still and very cold, the kind of cold that had an edge to it that the storm's cold hadn't quite had. "I do something similar," he said. "Different method." "What's your method?" "I get up," he said, "and I do the thing that's worrying me, even if it's 2 a.m. She looked at him. "Does that work?" "Better than lying there," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, not a polite sound. It surprised him too, she could see it. He looked at her like he'd heard a sound from a direction he hadn't expected. She gathered herself. "Yes," she said, "probably better than lying there." They cleared the path together, which took an hour. She managed the shovel in her own way, not the 2-handed standing swing most people used, but a shorter motion that worked with her balance rather than against it, slower but effective. Rourke worked the larger drifts, and she worked the path itself, and they met in the middle, and the path was clear. He looked at her when they were done. "You modified the technique," he said. I modify everything, she said. I've had to. Does it bother you? Having to modify everything? She thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. It used to, she said. When I was young, I spent a lot of time being angry that I had to find different ways to do things that other people just did. But at some point, she stopped. At some point, I realized that most people only know one way to do things, and I know 5. So I'm actually better prepared when the one way stops working. He was quiet for a moment. That's not how most people would look at it, he said. No, she said, but most people haven't had to. She went inside. He stayed to look at the drift against the smokehouse wall, calculating whether it needed management. She heated the remaining broth and added water and the last of the good turnips and started a fresh pot for the day. 7 weeks into the winter at Ironfang Ridge, Nora had stopped counting the days and started counting the tasks. It was a better measure. Days were just time passing. Tasks were evidence that you were still making things work. The rhythm of the cabin had become genuinely functional. She managed the food and the interior. He managed the trapline and the woodpile and the animals. They overlapped where it made sense and divided where it didn't, and there was no drama. In this, it was just 2 people doing the arithmetic of survival in a place that required it. She learned things about him in small pieces. He did not eat breakfast until he'd been awake for at least an hour. He drank his coffee black and hated sweet things except for dried apple, which he ate with an enthusiasm that seemed slightly out of character. He slept well and woke completely. No gradual emergence, just asleep, then awake and functional. He had one book, A Naturalist's Guide to Rocky Mountain Fauna, and he'd read it so many times that the cover was worn soft. And he opened it occasionally not to read it, but to check something specific, like a man consulting a tool he trusted. She didn't know what he learned about her. She assumed he was paying attention because that was how he functioned, but he didn't narrate it. 7 weeks in, and she was beginning to understand that this was sustainable. Not comfortable, the leg ached constantly in the cold, and the work was relentless. And there were days when the mountain felt like a wall rather than a landscape, but sustainable. She could do this. She was doing this, which was when the trap line took longer than expected. He'd gone out on a Tuesday to check the eastern slope traps, said he'd be back by dark. Dark at that point came at 4:15. By 5:30, she had the fire right and food warm, and she was not worried, exactly. She was noting his absence with the careful attention she gave to anything that deviated from the expected pattern. By 6:30, she was worried. By 7, she had moved from worried to methodical, which was what she did instead of panic. She checked the firewood inside enough for 3 days. She started heating extra water. She got the blankets out of the chest and positioned them near the hearth. She found the whiskey he kept in a shelf behind the tools, a bottle that was 3/4 full, and she put it on the table where she could reach it quickly. She fed the horses, not because they needed it early, but because she needed to do something that was outside the cabin, and that required her to think about something other than the dark. When she came back in, she stood by the window, and she looked at the dark, and the snow, and the tree line, and she thought about the fact that the nearest person was 20 miles away, and she had 28 cents. Then she heard the horse. Not Rourke, not his footsteps, not his voice. Just the gray, coming up the path at a walk. And that was wrong. The horse's pace was wrong. And she grabbed her coat and her crutch and went out without thinking about it. He was on the horse, but he was not sitting right. He was forward, one hand braced against the gray's neck. And even in the dark, she could see that his coat was open. And that was wrong, because no man in his right mind rode with an open coat at this temperature. Rourke, she said. Inside, he said. His voice was thick and slow. Get me inside. She got him inside. It took both of them working at it. She couldn't support his full weight, but she could anchor herself and give him something to push against. And they made it through the door, and he sat in the chair at the table, and she looked at him in the firelight. His hands were the color of a cloudy sky. His face was gray-white on one side where the wind had hit it. His coat had come open at some point on the trail, and his shirt beneath it was wet not from the outside, from sweating, which was the wrong kind of wet when the temperature was this low. How long were you in it? She said, already pulling the wet coat off him. Lost the trail, he said. Went south on the wrong ridge. How far south? Mile. He winced when she pulled the coat sleeve over his right hand. His fingers were stiff. Trail looked the same. Didn't realize until the terrain was wrong. A mile off course in this temperature in this terrain. She calculated and did not say the number out loud. Can you feel your hands? Not much. Your feet? Some. She went to work. She knew enough from her father's farm, from a winter where a hired hand had come in from the field too cold and too long exposed to know the sequence. Warmth, but slow warmth. Not fire, not yet. The blankets first to trap body heat. Dry clothes. The feet needed to come up off the floor. The hands could not go directly to the heat, or the damage would be worse. She stripped his wet shirt without asking permission. He didn't object or comment. She put the blankets around him, and she found the dry shirt she'd seen him keep folded on the shelf. She'd noticed it, because it was folded too precisely, like a man who'd been in the army too long, and she put it on him without fuss. Whiskey, she said. Table, he said. I know, not yet. Your body needs to warm first. Too much blood flow, too fast. She stopped. He wasn't going to argue. She didn't need to explain. 20 minutes. Then the whiskey. She put the chair he was in closer to the fire, not close, a careful middle distance, and she pulled a crate up beside him, and she sat on it, and she watched him breathe, and checked his hands every 5 minutes by pressing them and watching the color come back, which it did slowly, grudgingly, the way color comes back to things that have been very cold. You should be angry, he said after a while. She looked at him. At what? Getting lost. That was careless. You weren't careless, she said. The terrain was wrong, and you corrected for it. It just took time. It took too much time. Yes, she said. She wasn't going to argue that. But you're here. He looked at the fire. You prepared. I saw you coming in on the horse wrong. I'd already started preparing an hour earlier. He was quiet. You thought about what to do, he said, before you knew you'd need to do it. That's what I do, she said. I inventory, I calculate. I prepare for the things that might happen, because that's the only part I can control. He looked at her. His color was coming back. His hands were losing the gray tone. Whiskey now, he said. She checked his hands. Whiskey now, she said. She poured it and gave it to him, and he drank it the way a man drinks whiskey, when he actually needs it not for effect, just for the warmth. She put more wood on the fire and made the soup she'd had warming on the side and brought it to him, and he ate it slowly. I'd have been all right, he said at some point. Not defensively. Just stating it. You might have been, she said. You also might not have been. The horse knows the way. The horse knew the way, she agreed, and you were already not sitting right when you came up the path. So maybe. He thought about that. Maybe, he said. She cleaned up the wet clothes and hung them near the fire to dry, and she sat back on the crate and looked at him in the firelight and thought about 28 cents and the long dark between here and Red Hollow, and she thought about what it meant that she had handled tonight not perfectly, not without fear, but completely, without help, without anyone to tell her what to do. She had handled it. You're not what I expected, Rourke said. He said it to the fire, not to her. What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone who was trying harder to be useful. I'm not trying to be useful, she said. I am useful. There's a difference. He looked at her. Yes, he said. There is. The fire crackled. Outside the mountain was dark and still and cold, and the snow was deep, and the cabin was warm, and both of them were in it. Sleep, she said. I'll keep the fire tonight. He started to object. Your hands still aren't right, she said. You can't manage the fire properly until the feeling's fully back. I'll keep it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Wake me at 3. I'll wake you at 4, she said. He decided not to argue about the hour. She kept the fire. He woke her at 4:30 instead of waiting for her to wake him, which told her his hands were better. She heard him at the hearth, moving the way he moved when he thought someone was sleeping quieter than usual, which for Rourke Blackthorn was still quieter than most people managed when they were actively trying. She lay still for a moment and listened to the fire being built up properly and the sound of the coffee pot being set on, and then she got up because there was no point pretending. Hands, she said from the doorway. He held them out toward her without turning around. She crossed the room and pressed her thumb into his palm, watching the color respond. It came back fast. Good. Better, she said. Told you I'd be all right. You told me you might be all right, she said. Which is different. He didn't argue. He poured the coffee. They ate breakfast in the way they'd developed over the weeks, not silent exactly, but without forced conversation, each of them attending to their own thinking while the other was present. She'd come to value this more than she would have expected. Most people treated silence like a problem. Rourke treated it like weather, something you worked with rather than against. His right hand still had a stiffness in the outer fingers that he was trying not to show. She saw it when he picked up his cup, a slight adjustment, a grip that compensated for something. She didn't say anything. She filed it. After breakfast, he said, "I need to check the traps today. The ones I missed." She looked at him. "The eastern slope traps," he said. "Whatever's in them has been in them since yesterday. I can't leave them another day." She ran the arithmetic. His right hand was not fully right. The trail that had confused him yesterday was still the same trail. The temperature overnight had dropped further, which she knew from the sound the cabin made a particular tightening in the logs, a change in how the draft moved. "I'll go with you," she said. He looked at her, not at the crutch at her face. "The trail isn't describe it," she said. He described it. She listened and asked 3 questions: total distance, the elevation change on the eastern slope section, and the section where he'd gone wrong the day before. He answered each one. "I can do that," she said. "On horseback most of it," he said. "But the last quarter mile to the trap line is on foot. The slope's too steep and too narrow for the horses." "How steep?" he thought. "You'd need both hands." She thought about what both hands meant for her crutch in one hand, the other needed for balance on a steep slope. Both hands for the terrain left nothing for the crutch. "Show me the terrain when we get there," she said. "I'll decide on the ground." He was quiet for a moment. He was doing his own arithmetic. She could see it, not the pity calculation, not the is she capable calculation. The practical calculation, what she could contribute, versus what the trip required, versus what the cost of leaving the traps another day was. "Dress warm," he said. "Layers. And wrap your left leg before we go. I've got linen in the chest. Cold makes the ache worse, and a numb leg on that terrain is a problem." She had not told him the cold made the ache worse. She had been careful not to tell him that. "How did you know?" she said. "You move differently in the morning than in the afternoon," he said. "And you move differently when the temperature drops. You compensate, but the pattern is there." She stood for a moment. "I'll wrap the leg," she said. They left at 8, which was as early as the light was usable on the eastern slope. The gray carried him and the bay carried her, and the trail was the same trail it always was. She'd done sections of it now, in and out of the smokehouse runs he'd taken her on, the water source checking, the perimeter work that was part of maintaining a mountain homestead. But this was further than she'd been, past the first ridge and into the trees on the far side where the spruce grew close, and the trail narrowed to a suggestion. An hour in, she understood what he'd meant about the final quarter mile. The slope was a 40-degree grade up through a rock face that had enough handholds and footholds for a person who could use both hands freely, but that would require, for her, a completely different approach. She sat on the bay at the base of it and looked up. "I can see 3 routes," she said. Rourke was already off his horse. He followed her eyes. "I see the same 3, he said. "The left one has better lateral holds. I can brace the crutch against the rock face on the lower section and use the upper section hands-free because the angle changes." He looked at the route she meant. She watched him trace it. "The crutch tip against that ledge," he said, "if it slips." "I know," she said, "but the center route has nothing for the crutch at all, and the right route is actually steeper than it looks from here." "It is steeper," he agreed. She got off the bay. She took a moment to let her leg settle. Dismounting always required a beat of adjustment, and then she went to the base of the left route, and she looked at it up close. "Go first," she said. "Show me the footholds." He went up slowly, pointing out each reliable hold as he went. She watched with the attention she'd always had for physical problems, not with the anxiety one worried about failing, but with the focus of someone who needed to understand the system before attempting it. He reached the top and looked down. "The third hold on the right is loose," he called down. "Go wide of it." "Got it," she said. She went up. It was not graceful. It was not fast. There was a section in the middle where she had to pause and redistribute her weight in a way that was uncomfortable and required more arm strength than she normally needed because her left leg couldn't push as reliably as her right on the angled surface. She went wide of the third hold. She used the crutch against the rock face in the lower section exactly as she'd planned. She made it. At the top, she was breathing hard, and her left leg was burning from hip to knee, and her right shoulder was going to ache tomorrow. She stood straight and let her breathing even out, and did not comment on any of this. Rourke said nothing. He turned and led her to the first trap. They worked the trap line for 2 hours. 7 traps, 4 of them with animals that needed handling, the others needing resetting and checking. She managed the parts she could manage and stepped back from the parts where her mobility on the rough terrain made her a liability rather than an asset. And she did this assessment herself without waiting for him to direct her, which she could see he noticed. On the way back down the slope, she found a better route than the one she'd used. Going up the angle of the descent changed the whole calculation, and the right side route, which had looked steeper from the bottom, was actually manageable on the way down, because she could face the slope and use the crutch as a third point of contact descending. She made it down faster than she'd gone up. Rourke was already at the horses. He looked at her when she came to the bay. "Different route," he said. "Better for the descent," she said. "I saw that," he said. "I would have gone down the same way I went up." "That's because you have 2 good legs," she said. "You don't have to think about it as carefully." He was quiet for a moment. "You thought about it on the way up. You were already planning the descent." "I think about everything twice," she said, forward and back. He helped her with the horse, not because she couldn't mount, but because they were on a slope, and the bay was restless, and it was simply faster with 2 people, and he knew that, and she knew that, and neither of them made anything of it. They rode back in the early afternoon. Her left leg was past aching and into the deep bone pain that she usually only got in the worst cold snaps, the kind of pain that required an act of will to ignore rather than the ordinary daily discipline. She breathed through it. She attended to the trail. When they got back to the cabin and she slid down from the bay, her left leg buckled. Not collapsed, buckled, a single failure of the joint before she caught herself on the stirrup and righted herself and stood. The whole thing took perhaps 2 seconds. Rourke was at the gray's head and did not look over. She stood for a moment, waiting for the leg to report its situation. It reported present, functional, angry. She walked to the cabin. She put water on for the horses, and she started on the midday meal because it was past noon and they hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the work had been real work, and they both needed food. The meal was a simple thing, cornbread again, the staple, and venison sliced thin from yesterday's smoking and fried fast in the pan with a little of the lard. She stood at the hearth and did it, and her leg burned, and she cooked. Rourke came in when she was plating it. He sat down. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "How bad is it?" he said. She looked at him. "The leg? It'll be fine by morning." "How bad is it right now?" She thought about saying fine. She had said fine with her leg to everyone for 5 years, because fine was what people wanted to hear, and anything other than fine made them either pity her or hold her back from things she needed to do. "Significant," she said. "Not dangerous, significant." He nodded, he ate. She sat down carefully. The chair helped. Having her weight off the leg helped immediately, and the pain dropped from a shout to a steady complaint within a few minutes. She ate, and the food was plain and good, and she was hungry enough that it was more than adequate. After this, Rourke said, "We don't do the trap line together unless the weather is different." She looked up. Because 2 people on that terrain means 2 different risk profiles," he said. "I've been running that line alone for 3 years. The route I take accounts for what I can do. It doesn't account for what you can do, which is different, and today I was thinking about my route instead of yours, and that's a problem." She thought about this. It was not what she'd expected him to say. "Next time you need that line checked," she said, "you tell me the layout, and I tell you the route that works for me. We plan it together." "Yes," he said. "That's what I should have done today. You didn't know I'd want to come." "I knew you'd want to come," he said. "I just didn't think about the planning part." She ate for a moment. "Your right hand," she said. "How is it?" He set his fork down and opened and closed the hand. The outer 2 fingers were slower than the inner ones. 70%, he said. "Don't use it hard today." "I know, I mean it," she said. "Not the firewood, not the heavy lifting." "I'll manage the firewood this afternoon." He looked at her. "You manage the trap line," she said, "with a hand that is 70%. Fair exchange." He thought about arguing. She could see him consider and discard it. "Fair exchange," he said. She brought in the firewood that afternoon. 3 loads, which was what they needed for overnight, and it took her longer than it would have taken him. And 2 of the loads required her to split the weight differently to manage her crutch on the icy path between the lean-to and the cabin door. On the second load, she slipped on a patch of ice and went down on one knee and dropped the wood and had to reload it and get back up, which was an involved process on ice with one unreliable leg. She did it. She got the 3rd load in and stacked it, and she stood by the hearth, and her hands were cold through the gloves, and her leg was informing her that the morning's work plus the afternoon's firewood was more than it wanted to do in one day. She was not going to mention this. What she was going to do was make supper and bank the fire for the night and sleep and wake up tomorrow and inventory what needed doing and do it. Rourke came in from wherever he'd been. She heard him at the water barrel outside, then his boots on the step, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the firewood stack. 3 loads, he said. Yes. He came in. He looked at her. He had the look he got when he was assessing something he hadn't fully accounted for. Sit down, he said. I'm making supper. Supper can wait 10 minutes. Sit down. She looked at him. Please, he said. The word came out like it didn't get much use, but he knew where he'd put it. She sat down. He went to the chest where he kept supplies, and he came back with a piece of flannel and a small tin that she hadn't noticed before. He set them on the table. Your mother's, she said, meaning the tin. Trapper, I knew, he said. Bear grease and pine tar and a few other things. He swore by it for joint pain. He set it in front of her. For the leg, she looked at the tin, then at him. I don't need, she started. I know you don't need it, he said. I'm not saying you need it. I'm saying it helps, and you've had a hard day, and there's no reason not to use it. He stepped back from the table like he wanted to make clear he wasn't hovering. It's practical, not pity. She opened the tin. It smelled like pine and something animal and something else she couldn't name. A little sharp, a little medicinal. She looked at it. Practical, she said, yes. She used it. She applied it through her stocking because she was not
going to roll her trouser leg up the table.
And even
through the wool, she could feel the warmth of it starting within a few minutes.
A deep, penetrating warmth that was different from the fire's surface heat. She made supper. It was a better supper than she'd intended. She'd been planning simple. But the warmth in her leg had made her mind work better, and she found herself making a proper pan gravy from the venison drippings and a second round of cornbread from scratch, and using the dried apple Rourke hoarded for himself to make something. That was almost a sauce, sweet and tart, that she put on the side. He looked at the dried apple portion of the meal with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something between surprise and a complaint. You used the apple, he said. You had enough for 3 more servings, she said. I used one. I was saving it. For what? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Exactly, she said. He ate the applesauce without further comment. But she caught him, in the last scraping of the pan, being slightly more deliberate about it than he was about other food, and she filed that information carefully for future use. December settled over Ironfang Ridge like a decision that had been building since October. The temperature dropped to ranges that required constant management. The fire could not be allowed to drop below a certain level overnight, or the water in the indoor barrel would skin over with ice by morning, which had happened once in the first week, and which Nora had resolved never to allow to happen again. She developed a system for the overnight fire banking that she'd refined over 6 nights of trial and error, adjusting the airflow and the size of the backlog piece by piece until she had a configuration that held through a 7-hour sleep without requiring attention. Rourke watched this development over the 6 nights without comment. On the 7th morning, he looked at the fire and then at her. You figured it out, he said. Tuesday night was close, she said. I had it wrong on the airflow. I've been banking that fire for 3 years, he said. How often did you wake up in the night to tend it? He thought. Every few nights. You weren't banking it efficiently, she said, without heat. The back piece was too large. It choked the coals. He looked at the fire for a long moment. Show me. She showed him. He listened with the attention of a man who did not have trouble learning things from people who knew them better than he did, which she'd noticed was rarer than it should have been in men of his age and disposition. Huh, he said. That was his version of I was wrong about this, and I appreciate the correction. She was starting to understand his vocabulary. December brought 2 more storms, both shorter than the first. Between them, the days were bright and brutally cold, and there was a quality to the light at this altitude that she hadn't experienced anywhere else, hard and clean and very clear, the kind of light that makes shadows sharp-edged and distances deceptive. She started going outside in the afternoons for 30 minutes, even when there was no specific task, just to be in the air, which was what her body needed when it had been inside too long. Rourke didn't ask why she was going out. He started coming with her, on the days he wasn't on the trap line, and they'd walk the perimeter of the homestead in a circuit that she'd mapped herself 160 yards on the flat, manageable on her crutch if the path was maintained, which she maintained. He'd walk it at her pace, which was slower than his natural pace by about 1/3, and he never rushed it or shortened it. One afternoon in mid-December, he stopped on the south end of the circuit and looked out at the ridge line to the west. The sky behind it was a particular shade of orange, and the ridge itself was black against it, and the spruces on the near slope were layered in snow, and the whole composition had a stillness that didn't have anything to do with beauty exactly. More like accuracy, the mountain was being exactly what it was. "I don't miss it," he said. She looked at him. "Miss what?" "The East, town's people." She thought about this. "You miss anything?" He thought. "Noise, that means something's happening," he said. "Not the noise itself. The information. Up here the only news is weather. Some people would say that's enough news. Some people haven't been through a winter that tries to kill you," he said. She looked at the ridge. "I like knowing what I'm dealing with," she said. "The mountain tells you. It's not polite about it, but it tells you. People aren't polite about it either," he said. "They're just slower." She looked at him. "Is that how you read people? Like weather?" "Poorly," he said. "I'm better with terrain. You read me accurately enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not difficult to read," he said. "You say what you mean. Most people find that difficult. Most people find it convenient for themselves when others don't say what they mean," he said. "Saves them from having to respond honestly." She turned that over. "Is that why you've been alone?" He looked at her. It was a direct question, and she'd asked it knowing it was direct. "Partly," he said. "And partly I never found a person worth adjusting myself for. And now?" He looked back at the ridge. "I'm adjusting," he said. She turned away from the ridge and started back toward the cabin because it was cold, and because she needed a moment to put that observation where it belonged, which was somewhere she wasn't ready to identify yet. He fell into step beside her, and they walked the rest of the circuit without talking, and the cold came down with the dark, and the cabin lights were visible through the trees, amber through the small windows, and it looked like a home. She cooked that evening with more care than the ingredients strictly required. He didn't comment on it, but he sat at the table longer than usual after eating. 2 days before Christmas, though, she'd lost track of the calendar and had to count back from the last date she'd written in her journal to be sure the second major storm of December arrived. This one was faster and harder than the first, moving in during the night and making itself known by morning in a way that meant business. Snow was horizontal by breakfast. The temperature was the kind that makes metal unreliable and breath freeze on your face within seconds of going outside. Rourke checked the animals at first light and came in covered in snow and said, 3 days at minimum. Nora was already making a full inventory. 3 days meant specific things: firewood requirements, food requirements, water requirements. The horses needed more feed in this temperature. The smokehouse needed checking, which Rourke did immediately, and reported the latch had held and the seals were good her work, from the first storm still holding. She laid out the food plan for 3 days while he managed the firewood, bringing in enough for 2 days inside and stacking it in the covered space at the back of the main room where she'd cleared a spot for exactly this possibility. She'd cleared it 3 weeks ago. He'd noticed it at the time and not asked. Now he was using it without comment. The first day of the storm was functional. They had things to do, and they did them, and the cabin was warm and the food was good. The second day, the wind shifted, and the sound changed from the general roar of heavy snowfall to something more directional, a constant pressure from the northwest that made the cabin creak in ways she wasn't used to. The fire behaved differently in the directional wind. The draft reversed twice, and the first reversal put smoke into the room before Rourke adjusted the damper. She was watching him work the damper when she said, "The log on the northwest corner." He stopped. "What about it?" "It's creaking differently than the others. It started an hour ago." He went to the northwest corner and put his hand on the log. He listened. After 30 seconds, he stepped back. "Checking the chinking," he said, and got his coat. She waited. He was back in 10 minutes, snow in his hair and beard, and he was already moving toward the tools on the workbench before he said, "Gap. The storm is pressing it. Not dangerous, but it needs filling before morning, or we'll have cold air infiltration on the sleeping side." She was already at the chest where she'd seen the chinking material 3 weeks ago, noting it because it was the kind of thing you noted. "This," she said. He turned. "Yes." He took it. "How did you?" "I know where everything in this cabin is," she said. "I inventoried on the second day." He looked at her. "Everything?" he said. "Everything," she said, "including the book behind the loose board under the bunk." He went very still. She looked at him. "I didn't read it," she said. "It was clearly put away intentionally, and I don't read things people put away intentionally." He was quiet for a moment. "Then it's letters. From before. You don't have to explain it. I know I don't, he said. I'm telling you because you'd wonder otherwise, and I'd rather you know than wonder. She looked at him for a moment. Was she important? She was, he said. She's been gone 11 years. I'm sorry. He nodded once. The way he nodded when something was true and acknowledged and closed. I'll fix the chinking, he said. I'll hold the light, she said. He worked on the gap for 40 minutes, which required him to be on a step stool near the ceiling in the sleeping room, with inadequate light, and a material that needed careful application in layers. She held the lamp where he needed it, adjusting when he said left or up or hold, and she didn't talk because he was concentrating, and she'd learned that he concentrated better without noise. And when he was done and stepped down, he checked the corner log again, and the creak had changed, not gone, but quieter, more settled. Better, she said. Better, he agreed. He looked at the lamp in her hand. Good, steady hands. I've been told I have good hands, she said. By a doctor. It was the one compliment I got from the man who looked at my leg. He looked at her. Not with pity, with the specific attention he gave things that mattered. What did he say about the leg, he said? That it would always ache. That it would worsen in cold and improve in warm. That I'd develop strength in the rest of my body to compensate. And that over time the compensation would be more reliable than the leg had ever been. She paused. He was right about all of it. Sounds like a good doctor. He was 62, and he smelled like camphor, and he talked to me like I had a brain, she said. In 1878, that was exceptional. Rourke almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved in the direction of a smile and stopped there, which was apparently as far as it went. Go back to the fire, he said. I'll clean up here. The third day of the storm was the hard one. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went catastrophically wrong. It was simply the third day in a small space, with a large storm pressing against every wall, and the human cost of that is harder to manage than the logistical cost. She'd known this going in. She'd felt it before in bad winters on the farm, when the family had been inside together for too long, and the air got thick with things people weren't saying. What she hadn't expected was Rourke. He got quieter on the third day, which she hadn't thought was possible given his baseline. Not in a withdrawn way, he answered when she spoke. He did his share of the work. But the quiet had a different quality, like something that needed processing was being processed, and she recognized it because she did the same thing, and she gave him room. She spent the afternoon on a piece of sewing she'd been putting off. His heavy coat had a seam separation at the left shoulder that had been getting worse for 6 weeks, and she'd been working around it because he used the coat every day, and she'd needed a long run of indoor time to fix it properly. She worked on it by the fire, while the storm did its worst outside, and the cabin held and the fire burned, and Rourke sat at the workbench with a piece of wood he was carving. She hadn't seen him carve before. He did it with a concentration that was different from his other work, slower, more interior. She didn't ask what he was making. At one point, she pulled a particularly difficult stitch in the coat lining and said something under her breath that was not a word she said in front of people generally. Rourke looked up from his carving. He looked at the coat. What's wrong with it? He said. The lining pulled away from the shell, she said. When the seam separated, the stress transferred inward, and now the lining is bunched, and I have to stitch it back down without being able to access the inside properly. Why can't you access the inside? Because the shoulder is structured, she said. There's padding in it. He was quiet for a moment. Can I help? She looked up. You sew? I sew what I have to, he said. I can hold the shell in a way that might give you better access. She thought about it. Come here, she said. He came, and she showed him what needed holding and how, and he held it with the precision of a man who understood that precision in small things mattered the way it mattered in big things. And she was able to get the needle where it needed to go and work the lining back into place. It took them 40 minutes together for a repair that would have taken her 2 hours alone, if she could have managed it at all. When it was done, she held the coat up and looked at the shoulder. Good, she said. Good, he said. He went back to the workbench. She watched him pick up the carving and turn it in his hands and set it face down before she could see what it was. She filed that too. January came in harder than December had left off. The temperature dropped to ranges that Rourke noted with the same matter-of-fact accounting. He applied to everything 15 below in the night, single digits in the day. The kind of cold where the sap in the trees froze and split the wood with sounds like rifle shots. She heard the first one in the second week of January at 3 in the morning, A crack so sharp and close she sat bolt upright in the bunk, thinking something in the cabin had given way. Rourke appeared in the doorway of the sleeping room, already dressed. "Timber," he said, "on the east slope. Cold split it." She breathed. I know," he said. "It sounds wrong the first time." She lay back down. She could hear her own heartbeat for a while. "Does it happen often?" she said. "In this cold, yes." He was leaning against the doorframe. "You'll get used to the sound." "I'll add it to the inventory," she said, which wasn't meant to be funny, but he made that almost smile again, and she saw it this time clearly. The animals became her project in January, or rather the animal shelter became something she'd reorganized and improved in December, and was now managing as a regular part of her daily circuit. Rourke had kept the horses adequately. He was too practical to neglect the animals, but adequately and well were different, and she'd learned enough from her father's farm to know the difference in how an animal holds itself when it's kept well versus merely kept. The gray was a straightforward horse. He knew his business and was not interested in being interesting. The bay she'd come in on had a more complex personality, anxious about certain sounds, needy in cold weather, prone to working herself up if she sensed tension in the people around her. Nora had spent the first weeks simply being present in the shelter without demands, letting the bay understand that presence was neutral. And by January, the bay came to her without prompting and stood quietly while she worked around her. "You gentled her," Rourke said one morning, watching from the shelter door. "She was already gentle," Nora said. "She just needed someone to be consistent." He was quiet, then same thing sometimes. She looked at him over the bay's neck. He was looking at the gray, not at her. She went back to checking the bay's hooves. It was January 15th. She knew the date because she'd started keeping the journal more carefully, needing the record of days to stay oriented in a winter that wanted to make all days the same when the second serious crisis of the season arrived. Rourke had gone to the western ridge to check a section of fence line he'd been monitoring. The fence was peripheral. It marked the boundary of his land claim. Not a functional fence, but someone had been moving on the western approach, and he'd found signs of a camp 3 weeks earlier, and wanted to know if it was still active. He said he'd be back by noon. By 2 o'clock, she was at the window. By 3, she was making the same preparation she'd made in the night. He'd gotten lost on the eastern slope firewood inside. Extra blankets, water heating. Except this time, she also got his rifle from the rack by the door and checked that it was loaded, which it always was, and put it on the table where she could reach it. She had not been specifically trained with the rifle, but she had shot straight since she was 12. She'd told him that the first day, and it was still true. 4 o'clock. Dark. At 4:45, she heard the horse. This time, the pace was different from the night on the eastern slope, not the slow, careful walk of a half-frozen man, but a fast, uneven rhythm that was wrong for the trail condition. She got her coat and went out. Before the horse reached the homestead, and what she saw in the dim was the gray coming at a canter that was barely controlled, and Rourke in the saddle leaning right, which was wrong, because he always sat dead center. She got to the gray's head before it passed her, grabbed the bridle with her free hand and pulled hard enough to break the momentum, putting her weight into it, and the horse pulled, but she held and slowed it and pulled it down to a stop. Rourke was breathing through his teeth. "Off," she said. "Get down now." "I can get down," she said, and put herself against the horse's side where he could use her as a brace. He got down. He was holding his right side with his left hand, and when the firelight from the open cabin door hit him, she saw the dark stain across his coat on the right side, too large to be cold weather discoloration. "What happened?" she said. It came out flat, because if she let the alarm into her voice, she wouldn't be useful. "Fence line section was down," he said. "Old wire." Went over it and moved and winced sharply. The gray came down on a patch of ice. "I went off." "Fence wire on the ground." He looked at her. "It's not deep." "I don't think it's deep." "Get inside," she said. She tied the gray to the post without unsaddling because the horse would have to wait, and she got Rourke inside and into the chair at the table. The firelight was better inside, and she opened his coat and then his shirt and looked at what was there. He was right that it wasn't deep. What it was long, a gash running from just below his right ribs curving toward his back. The wire had caught him as he went over and dragged. The bleeding was steady but not fast, which was either good or meant it was bleeding somewhere she couldn't see. She pressed the cleanest cloth she had against it and told him to hold it. "I'm going to need to clean this properly," she said, "and close it." She met his eyes. "I've set splints, and I've done basic field care, but I haven't." "You can do it," he said. I know I can do it, she said. I'm telling you what it is so you know what we're doing. He looked at her. He looked pale in the way men look when they've been bleeding for a while, not the gray of the night on the eastern slope, but a washed quality, the color coming out of things. Tell me what you need, he said. She told him, and he told her where things were: the straight needles, the waxed thread he used for heavy repair work, the whiskey. She boiled water on the fire, and she used the whiskey on her hands, and on the needle, and on the wound itself, which made him go rigid in the chair for 20 seconds, and then breathe out slowly. That's unpleasant, he said. Yes, she said. Hold still. She had watched this done once, on the farm, when a hand had gotten a bad cut from a piece of machinery. The doctor's wife had done it because the doctor had been out. She'd watched carefully because she always watched carefully, and she had understood the mechanics, even at 15, the depth of the stitch, the spacing, the tension on the thread. You didn't close the wound too tight because the tissue needed room. You didn't leave it too loose because the edges needed contact. She closed the wound. Rourke held still through the whole procedure. He gripped the edge of the table with his left hand hard enough that she could see the tendons. He did not make a sound beyond a controlled exhale on the third stitch, which was the one that required the most manipulation of the tissue. When she was done, she looked at the line of stitches. They were not perfect. There were 7 of them, and the 4th was slightly uneven. But they were close, and they were holding, and the bleeding had stopped. She bandaged it with strips of the flannel, and she sat back on the stool, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. How bad is the 4th stitch, he said. She looked up. How did you know about the 4th stitch? Your breathing changed on it. She looked at the bandage. It's adequate, she said. It'll hold. It'll scar. It was already going to scar, he said. The scar will be uneven at one point, she said. He almost laughed. It was closer than the almost smiles, a sound in his chest that wanted to be a laugh, and was held back by the fact that laughing would move his ribs. I'll live with it, he said. You'll live, she said, and the flatness in her own voice surprised her. It came out harder than she meant it. Waited with the preceding 2 hours, and she turned back to cleaning up, because if she looked at him while she felt what she was currently feeling, that would be a different conversation than either of them was ready for. He stayed at the table while she dealt with the gray unsaddling, feeding, getting the horse settled in the shelter. She did it alone. When she came back in, he was still in the chair, but he'd moved the coffee pot to the hearth edge himself, which meant he'd gotten up and moved, and she chose not to comment on this because he was going to do what he was going to do. She poured 2 cups. She sat across from him. 7 men, he said, out of nowhere. She looked at him. 7 men had you in their household, he said, and not one of them understood that what they had was someone who could do all of this. He gestured with his left hand at the bandage, at the cabin, at some larger thing she understood to mean the entirety of the winter. They were looking at the crutch, he said. Not at you. She held her coffee cup. They wanted a workhorse, he said. They got a wolf and didn't know it. She looked at him across the rifle table in the firelight in the cabin on the side of the mountain, and she thought about Silas Weatherby's hand on her wrist and the mud on her dress and 28 cents, and how far away all of it felt right now. I didn't know it either, she said, for a while. He looked at her. You knew, he said. She thought about it honestly. I knew I was more than they thought, she said. I didn't know what word to put on it. Now you do, he said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the January night was absolute no wind, no storm, just cold so deep it had a physical presence, and the mountains sitting in it the way mountains sit in everything, without urgency, without drama, just there and large and entirely indifferent to the small bright thing burning inside the cabin on its slope. She banked the fire at 9. She checked his stitches, and they were holding. She told him to sleep on his left side, and to call her if the pain worsened, and he said he would, which she took to mean he would, if it became genuinely necessary and not before. She went to her bunk. She lay there in the dark and listened to the mountain and thought about the word wolf, and what it meant to have a word for yourself that finally fit, and how strange it was that the person who'd given it to her was a man she'd known for 4 months in a cabin past the edge of everything, who carved things he wouldn't show her and kept letters under the floor and almost smiled when she swore at difficult stitching. She thought about all of that for a while. Then she went to sleep. The stitches held. She checked them every morning for the first week, and every morning Rourke sat in the chair at the table with his shirt open and held still while she looked at the wound with the same focused attention she gave everything that mattered. The tissue was closing the way it should, slowly, irritably, with the particular ugliness of a wound that heals from the inside out. The fourth stitch stayed uneven. She'd been right about that. She didn't apologize for it, and he didn't ask her to. What she did not expect was how much the injury would cost them both, in ways that had nothing to do with the wound itself. Rourke was a bad patient. Not dramatic about it, he wasn't the kind of man who complained loudly or demanded attention. He was the other kind, which was in some ways worse, the kind who got up and did things he shouldn't do because sitting still felt like a form of failure, and who said he was fine when fine meant something different from what most people meant by it, and who had to be watched the way you watch a fire that looks banked but isn't. She watched him. On the third day after the injury, she came in from the animal shelter to find him at the woodpile splitting logs, left arm doing most of the work. Right side held rigid in the way people hold an injury they're trying to protect while pretending they aren't. She stopped in the doorway. "Rourke," she said. "Almost done," he said. "Stop," she said. He stopped. Not immediately he finished the split he was on, which she understood and allowed. Then he set the axe down and turned to look at her. "The wood needs—" "I'll do the wood," she said. He looked at her. "I'll do it differently than you do it," she said. "And it'll take longer. And some of the pieces will be too big. I'll manage it. Put the axe down." He put the axe down. She managed the wood that afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the afternoon after that. He was right that some pieces were too large. The splitting technique she'd developed used a lower swing with less body rotation, which worked for standard-sized logs, but left her with pieces that were thicker than ideal for the overnight fire. She adapted by adding a second split on the larger pieces, which meant more swings and more time. She was slower than him by half, and she knew it, and she did it anyway because it needed doing, and she was the one who could do it. On the fourth afternoon, Rourke came out and watched her for a minute without saying anything. Then he went back inside. When she brought the wood in, he'd rearranged the fire in the hearth so it would burn efficiently with the slightly larger pieces, which required a different configuration of the log placement. He didn't explain what he'd done or why. She looked at the fire and understood it and said nothing. This was how they communicated half the time by now, through objects and arrangements, and the particular intelligence of actions, taken for the other person's benefit without needing to be named. She found it more honest than most talking she'd done in her life. The trapline was her responsibility for 2 weeks. This was the thing she hadn't expected to be the hardest, because the trapline terrain was difficult under ordinary circumstances, and Rourke's injury meant she had to manage it alone, which changed the calculation significantly. The slope that had required 2 people the one time they'd done it together now had to be managed by one person, and that person had one reliable leg and a crutch and a stubbornness that she'd already determined was her best and most durable quality. She fell on the slope the first day. Not a bad fall. She caught herself on the rock face and came down on her right knee on a ledge and stopped there, 3 feet below where she'd been, breathing. She assessed the knee, bruised, not damaged. She assessed the root. She'd gone right of where she should have, trusting a hold that looked reliable but wasn't. She climbed back up. She found the better hold. She made it to the trap line. She checked 5 traps that day. 2 of them had catches that needed handling. She handled them with the same competence she'd shown when Rourke had been with her, working through the process in the cold, with her hands moving fast because fast was warmer than slow. She didn't tell him about the fall. She told him what the traps had, what needed resetting, what the snow condition looked like on the eastern slope. She gave him the information he needed to manage the operation from the cabin. She didn't tell him about the fall because telling him would mean he'd worry about the next time, and the next time she was going to manage the same route without falling, which she did on the second day and every day after that. She did slip once more, mid-February, on a patch of ice that had formed overnight on the approach to the slope. That one was unavoidable new ice, no visual warning, the surface looking the same as packed snow until the crutch tips skated on it. She went down hard on her left side, which was the bad side, and she lay on the ground for 30 seconds running her hands over her leg and her hip and her shoulder, assessing. Everything hurt. Nothing was broken. She got up. Rourke's injury healed in the way wounds heal when they're properly closed and kept clean, and the person who has them grudgingly agrees to limit their activity to a reasonable range. Slowly, and with complaints from the surrounding tissue that required weekly attention and occasional redressing. She checked the wound and managed the dressing and told him what she saw. And he asked practical questions, and neither of them treated it as anything other than a logistical problem, which was what they were both most comfortable with. By the end of January, he was doing half the woodpile work. By the second week of February, he was back on the trap line, though she went with him for the first 2 trips, because his right side was still not at full strength, and the slope required it. They'd developed a better system by then. For the 2-person version of the climb, she went first, and he came after, in a way that meant she had a spotter, without either of them having to say so. February was the month the winter showed its true character. The temperature in the second week dropped to ranges she hadn't seen before, and hadn't quite believed when Rourke had described them in October. The kind of cold where you could pour boiling water in the air, and it would hit the ground mostly solid. The kind where exposed metal pulled heat out of your hands through gloves, and the horse's breath in the shelter came out in continuous plumes that made the space look like a low fire. She developed a system for the horses in this cold that required 4 checks per day, instead of the usual 2. Earlier in the morning, later in the evening, to make sure their water hadn't frozen between checks. The bay required extra management in this temperature, becoming restless and ear-pinned in a way that could tip into something dangerous if ignored. Nora spent 20 minutes with her every morning before anything else, just being present, which she'd learned was the only real management that worked with a horse who was prone to anxiety. Rourke watched this from the shelter door one morning. "You've got away with her," he said. "She needs to know what to expect," Nora said. "She doesn't need comfort. She needs predictability." "Some people are the same," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the bay. "I know," she said. The food situation in February required a calculation she'd been putting off. The stores were adequate, but the margin was narrower than she wanted. The dried beans were lower than she'd projected because she'd been feeding them the horses as a supplement in the cold horses, needed more calories in extreme cold, and their grain supply was running thin, and while beans weren't grain, they'd helped. She'd made the decision herself, without consulting Rourke, because it was the right decision, and she'd understood that before he would have. When she told him, a week into February, he looked at the bean inventory and then at her. "When did you start supplementing?" he said. "3rd week of January," she said. "When the temperature dropped." "That was the right call," he said. "I know," she said. "But it changes the food math." She showed him the revised numbers. They went through it together, the way they went through complicated logistics, both of them looking at the same facts, each running their own calculations, then comparing. His math and her math came out to the same place, which was a slightly shorter margin than comfortable but not an emergency. "We hunt," he said. "The weather's been too severe. It's going to moderate next week," he said. "I know this ridge. It runs hard for 3 weeks and then it breaks. We're at 3 weeks." She looked at him. "You're sure?" "No," he said, which was the honest answer, and therefore the one she trusted. "But it's the pattern I've seen for 3 years. I give it 60%. I'll increase the bean rationing and hold the cornmeal flat," she said. "If the weather breaks and you can hunt, we're fine. If it doesn't break, we're managing but not dangerous." "Agreed," he said. He was right about 60% of the way. The temperature moderated but not the wind, which made hunting on the open ridge impossible, and hunting in the sheltered timber tricky. He went out on the 9th of February on a calm morning when the wind had stopped, and he was back by 3 with a young elk, which was more than a deer, and changed the math significantly. She worked the elk for 3 days. All of it the immediate butchering, the selection of what to smoke versus what to preserve cold in the larder, the bone broth that she ran in a continuous pot for 2 days until she'd extracted everything useful out of it, the fat that she rendered separately, because rendered elk fat had uses beyond cooking. She used it on her hands, which had gotten dry and cracked in the cold despite the gloves. She used it on the bay's muzzle, where the cold had chapped her. She put some in the tin with what remained of the pine tar mixture Rourke had given her in December for her leg. Rourke watched her work through the elk with the attention of a man who was genuinely learning something. She could feel it the specific quality of his observation when he was not just noting but filing. "The fat," he said on the second day. "I've been throwing it out. It's useful," she said. 3 different ways at least. "My trapper knew that," he said. "I forgot." "You were cooking for one," she said. "Some things only matter when you're running a proper household." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what this is?" She looked up from the rendering pot. "What would you call it?" he thought. "I'd call it exactly that," he said. I just hadn't said it out loud. She went back to the rendering. It was the second week of February that she noticed him at the workbench in the evenings. He'd always worked at the workbench, tools, equipment, leatherwork, the occasional structural repair. But this was different. This was the carving, the thing she'd seen him do during the big December storm, and he was doing it with the same focused interior attention, and he'd positioned the work so she couldn't see it clearly from where she usually sat. She noticed, but she didn't look. She was not a person who looked at things that were being kept private. She'd told him that about the letters, and she meant it as a general principle. What people put away intentionally was not her business until they made it her business. But she noticed. The carving went on for 3 weeks. He worked on it in the evenings after supper, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 20 minutes. The sound of it was a specific sound, the soft scrape of a good knife on hardwood, irregular, searching, and she'd grown accustomed to it in the evenings the way you grow accustomed to sounds that belong to a place. On the evenings he carved, she read. He had one book, but she'd found 3 months into winter that reading the same book multiple times produced different results than reading it once, because you were a different person each time through, and you caught different things. She was on her 4th pass through the Naturalist's Guide, and she'd started annotating the margins in pencil with questions and observations of her own, which she'd asked him about before starting because they were his margins. He'd said, "Write in it. It's more useful with notes." She wrote in it. One evening in mid-February, she looked up from the book to ask him something about a passage on high-altitude bird behavior and found him looking at her rather than at the carving. He looked away when she looked up. The carving was face down on the workbench. She asked her question. He answered it. The evening continued. But she thought about that look. The specific quality of it, not calculating, not assessing. Something older than that, something that had the same character as the almost smiles, an expression that existed in him, but that he didn't have much practice showing. She thought about it and put it in the inventory and said nothing. The end of February arrived and Rourke's wound was fully closed. The stitches long since out, the scar settled into a silver-red line along his right side that she'd seen when she'd done the final dressing check. The uneven 4th stitch had left a slight variance in the line, just as she'd predicted. He looked at it in the hand mirror and said nothing about it, which she took to mean he genuinely didn't care. She cared, in the specific way that a person cares about work they couldn't do better, but wishes they could have. She filed it in the same place she filed everything that was finished, acknowledged, not forgotten, no longer urgent. March arrived with the particular psychology of a mountain winter that is ending but not done. The light was changing, coming earlier and lasting longer, and there were days when the temperature rose above freezing for an hour or two in the afternoon. But there were also storms, March storms, that had a different quality from winter storms, wetter and heavier, and the snow on the roof was the weight of settled ice rather than fresh fall. And the overhang above the smokehouse door developed a drip during warm afternoons that froze again at night and formed a small, dangerous edge she knocked down every few days with a pole. The days felt different in March. She couldn't have said exactly what was different, but the rhythm of the cabin had changed in a way that was harder to name than the logistical changes. They talked more. Not longer conversations exactly, but a different kind of talking, not just logistics, not just planning, but the kind of conversation that doesn't have a specific purpose. That happens when two people have been in a place long enough that they're not performing themselves anymore. She told him about her sisters. All 3 of them, Clara, who'd married well and moved to Denver and wrote letters twice a year that were full of news about people Nora didn't know. Ruth, who'd died in childbirth at 26 and whose absence still felt like a gap in a sentence. Martha, who ran a boarding house in New Mexico and who was the most practical person Nora had ever met and who had been the one to find her the first situation after the accident. Rourke listened to all of this and asked questions that were specific and real, not polite questions, not the social performance of interest, but questions that said he'd actually heard what she'd said and wanted to understand it more fully. "Martha," he said, "she's the one you're most like." "People say Clara," Nora said. "We look similar." "I didn't say look like," he said. She looked at him. "Martha would be pleased to hear you say that," she said. "She'd probably also tell you to your face that she had her doubts about you when I first wrote to her about coming here." "You wrote to her?" He looked up. "Before we left Red Hollow," she said. "I left a letter with Agnes Pruitt to post." I told her where I was going and who with, and that I'd write when I could. He was quiet for a moment. And if you hadn't, she'd have come looking, Nora said, with the calm certainty of someone who knew this to be true. She's done it before. She found Ruth's husband drunk in a gaming hall in Santa Fe when Ruth was 3 months pregnant, and she brought him home by the ear, and he never went back. She paused. Martha is small, but her opinions are very loud. Rourke said, I would have liked to meet her. As if meeting Martha was a thing from a world that didn't quite apply to him. As if the ordinary social machinery of life letters, family, people who came looking for you, was something he observed from a distance. She'll come to Red Hollow in the spring, Nora said, when we go down for supplies. She said she would. He looked at her. You planned for the spring. It was not a question, but it landed like one. Because she realized, hearing him say it, that she'd made a plan that extended beyond winter, beyond the arrangement, beyond the spring they'd agreed she could leave if it didn't work. She'd made a plan that assumed a continuing. I suppose I did, she said. He went back to his coffee. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly, because that wasn't how either of them worked. And directly would have been the wrong approach for two people who communicated most honestly through things they did, rather than things they said. 2 days later, he started carving in the evenings with a new kind of purpose. She could hear it in the sound, more decisive, less exploratory. He was finishing something. She didn't look, she read her book. She wrote in the margins. She cooked their supper and mended the things that needed mending, and kept the fire the way she'd learned to keep it. And she didn't look. On a Saturday evening in early March, she knew it was Saturday because she'd been keeping the journal carefully for 2 months, and she'd verified the day that morning. Rourke set down the carving and was quiet for a moment. She looked up. He had it in his hands. He was looking at it. His expression was the same one he wore when he was deciding whether a thing he'd done was adequate or merely what he'd intended, which were not always the same. He stood up and walked to her chair. He set it on the table in front of her. It was a crutch. She stared at it. Not a crutch like hers, not the rough functional tool she carried, repaired twice, worn at the handle where her hand had worked the wood smooth over years of use. This was something else. He'd made it from a single piece of mountain hardwood, some close-grained wood she didn't recognize, dark and dense and slightly reddish in the firelight. He'd shaped the underarm rest so it curved, not flat the way standard crutches were made, but curved specifically, as if he'd spent time understanding the geometry of how she used hers and had built the curve to distribute the pressure differently. The shaft was turned smooth, not sanded to a furniture finish, but worked until the grain came through clean, the natural texture of the wood where it was meant to be gripped. The handle, the hand grip, was padded with soft hide. Deer he'd tanned himself, the particular softness of well-worked leather. At the base, fitted into a socket he'd carved and reinforced with a metal collar she recognized from the part's tin on the workbench, was an iron tip, not the flat rubber tip of her old crutch. A pointed iron tip, like a walking stick ferrule, ground to a point that would find purchase on ice, on frozen ground, on the packed snow of the trail. She sat and looked at it and didn't say anything for a long moment. I measured it from watching you, he said. How you move, where the pressure goes, the angle. He was standing to one side, not hovering but present. The armrest is cut for your height, not standard. Most crutches are made for average. You're not average height. She reached out and picked it up. The weight was the first thing she noticed, lighter than hers by a significant amount. But it didn't feel fragile. Dense, solid, just not heavy. She'd never held a crutch that didn't feel like carrying something. This one felt like an extension. She stood up. She put it under her left arm and stood with it for a moment, just standing. The curve of the armrest fit in a way that hers never had. Hers had always sat slightly wrong, putting pressure on the nerve bundle rather than the soft tissue, a minor pain she'd lived with. For so long she'd stopped registering it. This one sat in the right place. She walked across the cabin to the window and back. The iron tip on the wooden floor made a different sound than the rubber tip of her old crutch, sharper, more definite, a sound with weight to it. The grip under her hand was warm from the leather. The shaft was the right height. She didn't have to drop her shoulder to accommodate it, which was a compensation she'd made with her old crutch for years without thinking about it. She came back to her chair and sat down. She looked at the crutch in her hands. She looked at him. Something broke open in her chest, not violently, not the dramatic breaking of something under too much pressure, but the way ice breaks in spring, a crack appearing in a surface that had been solid for a long time. Not because the ice was weak, but because the season had finally changed. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried when Silas Weatherby put her bag on the boarding house porch. She had not cried in Agnes Pruitt's kitchen with 28 cents. She had not cried on the trail to Ironfang Ridge, or in the first cold nights in this cabin, or when her leg had buckled after the trap line, or when she'd been alone with a lamp and a needle and a man's torn side and nothing to rely on but what she'd watched once at 15. She cried now. Not a collapse, she was not the collapsing kind. It was quiet, just tears coming down her face in the specific way of tears that have been waiting a long time to have a reason that was good enough. She held the crutch in her lap, and she cried, and she did not try to stop it, because stopping it would have been the wrong response to what was happening. Rourke stood where he was. He didn't come to her. He didn't offer a handkerchief or put his hand on her shoulder or say anything. He simply stood there and let her cry and didn't make it into something she had to manage, which was exactly right. After a while, she stopped. She took a breath. She looked at him. "You spent weeks on this," she said. "Since December," he said. Since December, before the wound, before the worst of the cold. He had been making this since December. "You measured it without telling me," she said. "I didn't want to explain it before I knew if I could do it." "You could do it," she said. "It's not perfect," he said. "The arm curve, I did 3 versions before I got the geometry right. The third one's still under the bunk. I'll burn it." "Don't burn it," she said automatically. "Then, why would you burn it?" "It's wrong," he said. "It's your work," she said. "You don't burn your work." He considered this. She could see him actually considering it, the way he considered everything she said that was outside his normal framework. "All right," he said. She looked at the crutch again. She ran her thumb along the grain of the wood and felt the labor in it, the attention, the weeks of evenings, while she read and he carved, and neither of them said anything about what the carving was. "Why the iron tip?" she said. "The rubber tip of your old one slips on ice," he said. "I've watched you adjust for it all winter. The iron tip bites." She remembered the slip in mid-February, the ice that had no visual warning, the ice that had looked like packed snow and wasn't. "You knew," she said. "I saw it happen once," he said. "And I saw you adjust for it the other times to avoid it happening. The adjustment costs you." She looked up at him. "You were watching," she said. "I'm always watching," he said. It came out simply, not as a declaration, just as a fact about how he functioned. "I watch the terrain, the weather, the animals. I watch what's in the cabin." He paused. "I watch you." She held the crutch. He watched her. The fire was the only sound for a moment, the specific combination of crackle and settle that she'd memorized over months of keeping it. The voice of this particular hearth in this particular cabin on this particular mountain. "Come here," she said. He came. She stood up, which was easier than it had been in months, and when she stood, she was eye level with his chin, which she'd known but hadn't been this close to in a way that mattered. And she looked up, and he looked down, and she put her hand on his jaw, which had the rasp of 3 days of beard because he shaved when he went to town and nowhere else. And she kissed him. He kissed her back. It was not tentative, not the polite beginning of something. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been in close quarters for 6 months, and had both been aware of something for a while, and had both been waiting for the other one to say what they couldn't say any other way. It went on for a time, and when they separated, she was still holding the crutch with one hand, and had one hand on his jaw, and he had both hands on her shoulders like he'd needed something to hold. "I didn't choose you because nobody else wanted you," he said. His voice was lower than usual and more direct, like a man who'd decided to stop managing the distance between what he meant and what he said. "I want you to understand that clearly." She looked at him. "I went to Red Hollow looking for a specific person," he said. "I didn't know what she'd look like or where she'd come from. I knew what she'd have to be capable of. I knew what she'd have to be." He stopped. "You were in the street. You'd fallen and you got up, and you didn't look around to see who'd seen it. You just picked up your crutch and kept going." She was quiet. "The crutch didn't tell me anything useful," he said. "You did. In the 5 seconds after you fell." She thought about those 5 seconds. She hadn't thought about them since. She'd been too focused on the next thing, the way she always was. "I wasn't performing anything," she said. "I was just getting up." "I know," he said. That was the point. She put her forehead against his collarbone for a moment. He stood still and let her and put one hand very carefully against her back. "I'm still not easy," she said. "I'm not going to be easy." I know that, he said. I'll argue with you about things that matter. I've noticed, he said. I don't mind arguing with someone who's right. I'm not always right. More often than most, he said. She made a sound that was almost the laugh she'd made in January. He felt it against his chest, and something in him settled, the way the cabin settled after a long wind, not quiet exactly, but steadier. They separated eventually because the fire needed tending, and the horses needed a final check before the night temperature dropped, and there was supper to clear from the table, and all the ordinary management of a life that doesn't stop because something important has happened. She tended the fire. He checked the horses. She put the tin plates in the wash basin, and he came in and poured water for both of them, and they moved around each other in the small space, with the new awareness that things were different, and the new ease that nothing actually needed to change tonight because of it. She propped the new crutch against the wall beside her bunk where she could reach it in the morning. She looked at it before she put out the lamp. The firelight caught the grain of the wood and the iron tip and the soft leather of the grip, and she thought about December evenings when she'd heard the carving sounds and she hadn't looked. And she thought about a man who had studied how she moved so precisely that he could build a tool that fit her better than anything she'd owned in 9 years of using crutches. And she thought about what it meant to be understood in the specific way, not in the general sense of a person who cared about you, but in the precise technical sense of a person who had watched you carefully enough to know exactly where the old thing hurt you and where the new one wouldn't. She put out the lamp. The dark was familiar now. The sounds of the cabin at night were a catalog she knew by heart, the fire settling, the timbers adjusting, the horses in the shelter a low, distant presence, the ridge above doing what the ridge did in whatever weather was moving through. She lay down, and she was comfortable in the way that she hadn't been comfortable anywhere in a long time. Not just physically, she still hurt in the leg, and the shoulder and the knee she'd bruised on the slope in January, but in the way that you're comfortable in a place that is yours, in a life that fits, in a situation where you are not performing anything for anyone's benefit. She thought, this counts. Whatever happens next, this counts. She slept. The March days continued, each one a little warmer than the one before, each one a little longer in the light. The ridge beginning the slow release of a winter that had been holding everything tight since October. She used the new crutch every day and felt the difference every day in her shoulder, in her arm, in the way she moved through the cabin and the homestead and the path to the animal shelter. Her old crutch went in the corner by the workbench. She didn't throw it out. It had been reliable for 9 years, and reliability deserved some respect. Between them, things were the same and different. Same in that they did the same work, kept the same rhythms, talked in the same practical register, punctuated by the longer conversations that had developed over the winter. Different in that the management of distance was over. He sat closer to her at the table. She didn't move away when he came into a space she was working in. In the evening, sometimes she put her hand on his forearm and left it there, and he continued whatever he was doing, and neither of them commented on it. One evening in mid-March, he told her about the letters. Not all of it, not a long story, just the outline, given with the same economy he gave everything a woman in Missouri, years before the Army, something serious and then something final, a fever that didn't respond to anything, and then the particular silence of a person who was good with solitude, having the silence become involuntary. She listened and didn't try to fix it or soften it because it didn't need either. It was a thing that had happened to him and that he'd carried for 11 years, and that was now part of what she knew about him, which was what she needed it to be. She'd have liked you, he said after a pause. Nora thought about this. Would she? She was practical, he said, and she didn't have patience for pretense. He was quiet. You'd have argued about things. What kinds of things? The right kinds, he said. She thought that was one of the better things he'd said to her. On the last day of March, the snow on the south-facing slope below, the cabin started showing bare ground in the afternoons, not much. A few feet of dark earth at the edge of the cleared area, but the first bare ground they'd seen since October. She went and stood on it in the afternoon sun and felt the different quality of the cold, which was the cold of a retreating thing rather than an advancing one. And she looked at the ridge line above and saw that the snow there was starting to show the same gray undertone that means compaction, the change from fresh to old that precedes melting. Rourke came and stood beside her. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. Then the trail opens, she thought about Red Hollow. about Agnes Pruitt's porch and the main street and the mercantile and Jed Carver's ledger. About Martha, who'd said in her last letter before winter that she'd come in the spring. "I need to write to Martha," she said. "We'll send it when we go down for supplies," he said. "We." He said it the way he said most practical things, without calculation, without awareness that it meant something. She let it stand. She looked at the first bare ground of the year, still mud-wet and cold, but there. The edge of something. The beginning of the next part. "What does the homestead look like in summer?" she said. He considered. "Greener than you'd expect," he said. "The meadow on the east side comes in. Wildflowers on the upper slope in July." He paused. "It's loud compared to winter. Birds, water running," another pause. "I didn't know I noticed the difference until I had someone to mention it to." She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge. The afternoon light was the particular gold of late mountain winter, angled and clean, and it was on his face and on the snow and on the bare ground at her feet. She thought about all the things she'd inventoried since October. The stores, the firewood, the trapline yields, the wound stitches, the water vessels, the fire configuration. All the careful accounting of a winter that required counting. She thought, I should add this to the inventory. This moment, this man, this first mud of spring. She didn't write it down. Some things were better held than recorded. The trail opened in the third week of April. Not cleanly, the trail never opened cleanly at Ironfang Ridge. Rourke had told her that, and he was right. It opened in sections, the south-facing stretches going first, then the switchbacks, then the long north-facing traverse that held snow until it absolutely had to let go. They waited until the footing was reliable, because an unreliable trail in April was more dangerous than waiting one more week, and patience was something both of them had learned over a winter that had required it constantly. She packed the saddlebags herself. She knew the inventory well enough that she didn't need a list. She knew what they'd used and what remained, and what Red Hollow would need to supply for the coming year. The accounting was already done in her journal, precise and complete, the habit of 5 months of careful management. Rourke saddled both horses without being asked. She put on the coat she'd come in with, the good wool one he'd bought her in October, and she took the new crutch from beside the bunk, and she looked at the cabin one more time before going out. It looked different than it had in October. Not because anything structural had changed: the same rough walls, the same 2 windows, the same hearth that she'd learned to manage down to the specific configuration of the overnight logs. What was different was the evidence of occupation, the shelves reorganized for actual use, the annotated naturalist's guide on the table, the mended coat on its hook by the door, the small tin of pine tar compound with her thumb mark worn into the lid from months of opening it, a second chair pulled closer to the hearth than it had been the day she arrived. A home, she thought. The word fit without qualification. She went outside. The April morning was cold, but not the cold of deep winter, a different quality, the kind that retreats when the sun hits it. The snow on the open ground was granular and wet, the kind that takes weight without squeaking. The ridgeline above showed patches of dark rock where the melt had gone furthest. Rourke was holding the bay's bridle. She mounted better than she had in October, the muscle memory of months built into it now. The new crutch managed across the saddle with the ease of long practice. He mounted the gray. They went down the trail. The descent took 3 hours on wet footing, taking it slow, letting the horses find the safe line on the switchbacks. She'd ridden this trail coming up in October in the dark, and the cold and the anxiety of a decision not yet tested. She rode it now in April with the specific knowledge of someone who had tested the decision completely and found it sound. She knew every section of it, where the footing changed from packed earth to loose shale, where the spruce thinned and the aspens took over, where the first view of the lower valley appeared between 2 ridge shoulders, the valley still winter pale, but showing the early green of things deciding to come back. They stopped at that viewpoint without planning to, just both horses pausing, and neither rider correcting them. She looked at the valley. He looked at the valley. "Martha will come down from the north road," she said. "If she's on time, she'll be in Red Hollow before us. She'll find Agnes Pruitt," he said. "Agnes will tell her everything she knows, which is considerable. Will that be a problem?" Nora thought about Martha's small, direct opinions loud as she'd described. Martha, who had found a drunk man in Santa Fe and brought him home by the ear. Martha, who had written to her in December through Agnes Pruitt, "I expect a letter in the spring." A real one. Not 2 sentences about the weather. Martha will form her own opinion, Nora said. She always does. But she'll form it from what she actually sees. And what will she see? Rourke said. Nora looked at him. He was watching her with the gray eyes that had assessed in the mercantile in October with the same efficiency they assessed terrain and weather and everything that mattered. A woman who made it through a winter that tried several times to break her, she said. And a man who never once treated that as surprising. He was quiet for a moment. She'll see more than that, he said. Yes, Nora agreed. She will, they rode on. Red Hollow appeared below them an hour later, the cluster of buildings small and definite against the valley floor. She looked at it with different eyes than she'd had in October, not the eyes of a woman with 28 cents and no plan, but the eyes of a woman returning to a place she'd left, which was a different relation to it entirely. The town was going about its morning business when they came in off the North Trail. The street was mud-season wet, the same mud she'd fallen in 7 months ago, but the light was different now, higher, longer, the particular spring light of a Colorado valley coming back to itself. People noticed them. She'd expected this. Small towns noticed returnees the way they noticed everything, with the focused attention of people whose news is local and therefore precious. She saw heads turn on the mercantile porch. She saw Agnes Pruitt come to the door of the boarding house and stand in the frame with her iron-gray hair and her particular expression that was not warmth exactly, but was the frontier equivalent of it. And she saw, coming out of the feed store 30 yards ahead, Silas Weatherby. He saw her at the same moment. She kept riding. She let him be the one to step into the street. Nora, he said. She stopped the bay. Not because she owed him a stop, because ignoring a man in the middle of a street you both occupied was a pettiness she didn't have the energy for. She looked at him from the saddle. He looked bad, not dramatically bad, not the theatrical ruin of a man punished by the story's logic, just the ordinary bad of a hard winter, on a man who'd been struggling before winter started. He'd lost weight. His fence line, she could see from the road, had 2 broken posts. His barn door hung crooked. The winter was hard, he said. It wasn't an opening to a conversation exactly, more like a confession he hadn't meant to make out loud. It was, she said. He stopped. He looked at the crutch across her saddle, then at her face, and she could see him doing the arithmetic of what 7 months had done, and arriving at a number that confused him. He'd expected diminished. She was not diminished. I wondered if you might consider. No, she said. He blinked. You wanted someone you could use, Silas, she said. You had a use in mind, and I didn't fill it. That's honest enough, and I don't hold it against you. She kept her voice level. Not cold, she didn't have the anger left to make it cold. Just clear. But no, whatever you're about to ask, no. He looked at Rourke, who was on the gray 6 feet back, not forward and not threatening, just present in the way a mountain is present, there, large, entirely at rest. Rourke said nothing. He didn't need to. Silas looked back at Nora. He nodded once, not gracefully, not with the dignity of a man accepting something he deserved, just with the worn-down compliance of a man who has run out of alternative positions. All right, he said. He stepped back to the side of the street. She rode on. Behind her, she heard Rourke's gray move forward. She didn't look back at Silas. She'd given him what was honest, not vindication, not punishment, just clarity, and clarity was all she'd ever wanted from any of it. Not for him to suffer, not for him to grovel, just for the account to be settled at the true number. It was settled. Agnes Pruitt was still in her doorway. She watched Nora dismount in the street. With the new crutch, watched her set the iron tip into the mud and come down from the saddle and plant herself on the main street of Red Hollow, as if the street were something she'd decided to stand on, rather, than something she'd been deposited on. And her expression moved through several things before settling on something that might have been satisfaction. You look well, Agnes said. I am well, Nora said. Martha Bellrose arrived yesterday, Agnes said. She's in the back room. She told me everything she knows about you, which is substantial. I told her everything I know about you, which is also substantial. We agreed on most of it. Should I be concerned about what you agreed on? Probably not, Agnes said. We both think you're more capable than sensible people would be in your position. We mean it as a compliment. Nora almost smiled. It is one, she said. Martha appeared from the back room before Nora could go inside, which was entirely like Martha. She'd have been listening for footsteps, and moved before the door was fully open. She was 41 and looked like what happened when their mother's practicality and their father's stubbornness were compressed into a shorter person and given 30 years of running a boarding house to work on. She came through the door and stopped 3 feet from Nora and looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who has seen trouble in many forms and has developed a reliable taxonomy. She looked at the crutch. She looked at Nora's face. She looked past Nora at Rourke, who was at the hitching post with the horses, dealing with the saddlebags with his back, turned in the very deliberate way of a man giving people privacy he's decided they need. She looked back at Nora. Well, she said. Well, Nora agreed. Martha put both arms around her and held on, which was the most Martha had ever openly expressed about anything. And Nora held back and felt her sister's solid, small, fierce presence against her, and felt the winter in her chest do something she couldn't name release, some part of itself it had been holding. They separated. Martha looked at the crutch again. He made that, she said. It wasn't a question, yes. Show me the grip, Martha said. Nora held it out. Martha ran her thumb along the leather, the way Nora had done the first night, feeling the work in it. She turned the iron tip over and looked at the socket fitting. She handed it back. All right, Martha said, which from Martha meant considerably more than the 2 words. Rourke came up from the hitching post. Martha looked at him the way she looked at everything straight on, no performance, making up her own mind at her own speed. Martha Bellrose, she said. Rourke Blackthorn, he said. I know who you are, she said. Agnes briefed me. I'm deciding what I think. Take your time, he said. He said it without sarcasm, without deference, just as a reasonable statement about a reasonable process. Martha looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Nora. He'll do, she said, and went back inside to get coffee going. Rourke looked at Nora. High praise, Nora said. I got that impression, he said. They resupplied over 2 days. Rourke worked through the list with Jed Carver methodically, the list informed by Nora's precise inventory accounting, which impressed Jed enough that he said so, which Nora accepted without false modesty, because false modesty about competence was a thing she'd decided to stop doing somewhere around January. Martha stayed in Agnes Pruitt's back room and spent one long evening asking Nora the specific questions she'd come to ask, not prying into feeling, not the emotional audit of a concerned sister, but the practical accounting of a woman who wanted to know if her sister was genuinely all right rather than performing all right for someone else's comfort. She asked about the food stores, about the injury, about the trapline, about the winter storms. She asked about the crutch in the analytical way she'd examined it in the street. At the end of the evening, she said, You're different. How? Nora said. Martha thought. You're not waiting for the next thing to go wrong, she said. You used to carry yourself like a person waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Nora sat with that for a moment. I got tired of waiting, she said. And then I got busy. Martha laughed the real kind, the laugh she saved for things that earned it. That'll do it, she said. On the second day, Rourke found her in the mercantile looking at bolts of fabric. He came and stood beside her. For the cabin, he said. Curtains, she said. The windows. In winter, the cold comes through the gaps in the frame around the glass. Curtains won't fix it completely, but they'll reduce the draft on the sleeping side. He looked at the fabric. He picked up a bolt, a heavy wool in a dark blue green. This is thicker, he said. That's why I'm looking at it, she said. He set it on the counter. She looked at it. She looked at him. You're already planning next winter, she said, aren't you? He said. She was. She'd been planning next winter since February, running calculations as about what the stores should look like in October, what improvements to the smokehouse would help, whether a second animal shelter extension was worth the lumber cost, given what this winter had shown about the bay's temperature sensitivity. She'd been planning next winter the way she planned everything forward and back, accounting for what she knew and building margins for what she didn't. Yes, she said. Then we agree, he said. Jed Carver put the fabric on the account. They left Red Hollow on the morning of the third day, the pack horse loaded, the bay and the gray fresh from 2 days of decent pasture. Martha stood on Agnes Pruitt's porch and watched them go. Agnes stood beside her. At the edge of town, Nora stopped the bay and looked back. The town looked the same as it had looked in October when she'd ridden out of it. Same mud, same buildings, same particular exhaustion of a frontier settlement doing its best against the odds. The miners on their barrel were different miners. The original 3 had moved on. New ones in their place. The perpetual turnover of men chasing something. But she was not the same. She had ridden out of this town in October with 28 cents, and a decision she wasn't sure about, toward a winter she hadn't been able to imagine, with a man she couldn't yet read. She had endured things that winter that would have broken the version of herself who'd arrived in Red Hollow 7 months before that. Not because that woman was weak, but because she hadn't yet had the specific kind of testing that produces the specific kind of sureness she now carried. She had set a man's wound in a mountain cabin with no doctor for 20 miles. She had run a trap line alone on a 40-degree slope in January cold. She had kept a fire for a man who'd come in half frozen and managed his recovery and gotten back on the trap line 3 days later and not told him about the fall. She had learned what she was made of, which was something she'd suspected but hadn't proven. She looked at Silas Weatherby's fence line, the broken posts, the barn door that needed rehinging. She felt what she'd expected to feel: vindication, maybe, or the pleasure of being right. She'd expected some version of satisfaction. What she actually felt was simpler than that. Not pity, she was done with pity in both directions. Not contempt. Just the clean and final feeling of a woman who had walked through a door that used to be closed and was now so far behind her it wasn't a door anymore. Just a wall. She turned the bay toward the North Trail. Rourke was already pointed in that direction, waiting with the patience of a man who knew she'd take whatever time she needed and wasn't going to hurry her. She rode up beside him. "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They went up the trail. The years that followed on Ironfang Ridge were not easy and were not meant to be. That was the thing people in Red Hollow who watched them from a distance sometimes misunderstood. Growled, saw the homestead grow, saw the second shelter go up in the summer of the second year and the root cellar extension in the third, saw Nora ride into town each spring, looking more settled and more certain, and they assumed that ease was what they were watching. It wasn't. It was competence, which looks like ease from the outside and feels like very hard work from the inside. They fought about things. She was right that she'd told him she would argue, and she did, about the food management, about the trap line routes in bad weather, about the fence repairs schedule on the western boundary, about whether the gray was developing a hoof problem that needed attention before it became serious. She was right about the hoof. He conceded it without drama, and they moved on, the way people move on when they've agreed that being right matters less than being effective. He was right about things, too. The root cellar extension he'd wanted in the second year paid for itself in the third winter, which ran harder and longer than anything they'd had before. His read on the ridge's weather patterns proved reliable enough that she started trusting his 60% estimates as working probabilities rather than guesses. They had 2 children, eventually. A girl first, then a boy, born into a cabin that Nora had spent years making as prepared as she could make it for exactly this, including a correspondent she'd struck up with a midwife in Red Hollow 3 years before the first pregnancy. Learning what she needed to know in the methodical way, she learned everything. The girl, Eleanor, inherited Nora's coloring and Rourke's eyes and a stubbornness that was entirely her own. The boy, James, was quieter than either of his parents and had the particular gift of being comfortable with silence, which made him good company at altitude. Word spread. The way word spreads in frontier country, slowly, through trappers and travelers, and the occasional family passing through on a bad trail with a sick horse or a sick person and nowhere else to go. The Blackthorn homestead passed Ironfang Ridge. The woman there who could close a wound and preserve meat and talk you through a bad winter night if that was what you needed. Nora helped a woman through a labor gone wrong in the autumn of the 5th year. A settler family who'd been caught by early weather on the upper trail and had nowhere else. She'd never done it before. She'd read about it. In the specific way she read about things she thought she might need. And she'd talked to the midwife in Red Hollow at length. She did what needed doing. The mother and the child were both all right. Mostly. The word that spread after that was more specific. Rourke was still large and still intimidating to people who didn't know him, which was most people, since most people didn't get close enough to know him. But travelers who'd sheltered at the homestead told a different story than the one Red Hollow told, and gradually the 2 stories worked on each other until what remained was closer to the truth. A hard man and a harder woman in a place that required both of them to be exactly what they were. Martha came every year until her knees made the trail impossible, which happened in the 7th year, and after that Nora went down to her in Red Hollow for a week in the summer, and they sat on Agnes Pruitt's porch. Agnes was still alive, still managing the boarding house, still had opinions on everything, and they talked the way sisters talk, when they've both spent a year doing the work of a life and need to compare notes. Agnes died in the 9th year. She left the boarding house to her niece, and she left Nora, specifically the red oilcloth from the backroom table. Nora kept it. She put it on the cabin table, and it sat there for years. A piece of the morning, she'd eaten eggs and salt pork on 28 cents and decided that the next decision she made was going to be different from all the previous ones. She never regretted the decision. That wasn't what she told the settlers who came through, the women especially, the ones who'd been told they were too much of one thing and not enough of another, too slow or too small or too particular in their needs to be useful to any reasonable man. She didn't tell them she hadn't regretted it because that sounded like a promise, and life on Ironfang Ridge had taught her that promises about how things would turn out were above her authority to make. What she told them was this: the people who rejected you were telling you about themselves, not about you. They needed a specific thing, and you weren't it, and that's a logistical fact, not a verdict. The verdict about what you're worth is yours to deliver, and you deliver it by what you do with the years you have, not by waiting for someone to revise their opinion of you. She told them this at the rough table, under the lamp, with the red oilcloth underneath, and the fire going in the way she'd learned to keep it. And Rourke would be somewhere in the room at the workbench, or by the hearth, or outside checking the animals, and the homestead would be doing what it did, which was hold, which was the one thing she'd needed it to do, and the one thing it had never failed at. 7 men had seen a woman with a crutch and a limp and a skill set that didn't match what they needed. They'd looked at what she couldn't do and made their calculation. One man had watched her get up from the mud in a small street in a small town on a bad October morning and had asked a different question. Not what can't you do, but what can you do? She'd answered him honestly, and then she'd spent a winter proving it, and then a life. The crutch he'd made her in February of that first winter lasted 11 years before the wood finally showed wear she couldn't repair with her own maintenance. By that point, Eleanor was 12 and had been watching her mother's hands her whole life and had opinions about what replacement wood should be and how the arm curve should be adjusted for the way Nora's posture had shifted with age. Rourke made the second one too. It took him less time because he already knew exactly how she moved.